The Volga River stretched like a ribbon of steel across the Russian landscape, its waters flowing quietly under a somber sky. To the east, beyond the rolling steppe, lay a city unlike any other, Stalingrad. The city, named after the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, sat at the very crossroads of history, a silent titan on the banks of the mighty Volga. For the people living there, the days flowed with a quiet routine, untouched by the raging storm that loomed beyond their borders. It was a place of factories, of workers, of life, unaware that in the coming months, it would become the very heart of a war that would engulf the world. Stalingrad was more than just a city, it was a symbol, a key to the vast resources of the East. To the Soviets, it was a place of pride, of strength, of defiance. To the Germans, it was an obstacle standing between them and the oil fields of the Caucasus, the gateway to victory in the East. And yet, for all its importance, it was a city like any other, alive with the hum of daily life, unaware of the brutality that was about to descend upon it. In the streets, workers moved swiftly, their faces set with the determination of people who had known hardship and had built their lives from the dust of the earth. The factories hummed with activity, turning raw materials into weapons of war, each machine a cog in the vast Soviet industrial machine. Children ran through the streets, their laughter echoing off the walls of their modest homes, while soldiers, young, old, and everything in between, stood guard at strategic points, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. But there was no sense of impending doom here. No whispers of the storm that was building in the west. The city felt alive, but it was a life on borrowed time. It was late summer when the first German reconnaissance planes began to circle the skies above Stalingrad. High above the bustling streets, far out of reach of the casual observer, the Luftwaffe's sleek aircraft flew like vultures, their engines a quiet hum in the distance. The pilots, their eyes trained on the ground far below, saw what they had come for, the city, sprawling out along the banks of the Volga, a strategic gem of unparalleled importance. To them, Stalingrad was a prize, a mark on a map that would tip the balance of war in favor of the Axis powers. But what they did not see, what they could never have seen, was the resolve of the people below. They could not hear the footsteps of the soldiers marching to defend their home. They could not feel the pulse of the city, beating steadily as it unknowingly prepared for the slaughter that would soon engulf it. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler and his generals pored over the intelligence reports, calculating their next move. The city of Stalingrad had become more than just a strategic objective, it had become a symbol of Soviet defiance, a place that must be taken to break the spirit of the enemy. The Führer, with his characteristic obsession, had already set his eyes on the prize, even before the invasion had fully begun. The city would fall, he believed, just as every other city had fallen before it. The German war machine was unstoppable, and with Stalingrad in their hands, the war would be over. But Stalin, too, had set his sights on the city. Stalingrad was his name, his legacy. He could not afford to let it fall. The Soviet leader's command was simple, not one step back. Every man, every woman, every child would fight to defend it. They would give their lives, if necessary, to protect the symbol of Soviet strength that lay on the Volga's banks. And so, as the reconnaissance flights buzzed overhead, both sides prepared. The Germans massed their troops to the north and south, ready to encircle the city with their panzer divisions, while the Soviets began to fortify their defenses, their will harden like steel. The calm before the storm was almost unbearable, a sense of waiting that hung heavy in the air. In Stalingrad, the workers continued their labor, the soldiers stood watch, and the civilians went about their lives, unaware that the war that had been raging for years was about to swallow their world whole. The city was at the mercy of fate, and fate had already chosen its path. In the summer of 1942, as the sun blazed over the vast expanse of Eastern Europe, Adolf Hitler set his sights on a new and ambitious target, the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. This would be the next phase in the war that had already reshaped the world. The German war machine, still fueled by early victories, was advancing eastward with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. The plan was bold, audacious, an operation that promised to break the Soviet Union and bring the war to a swift and victorious end. This was Operation Blau, Operation Blue. A grand offensive aimed not only at securing the oil fields but at inflicting a mortal blow on the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this was not just about territory. It was about resources, the fuel needed to continue the war, and the hope of breaking Stalin's resolve once and for all. It was the lifeblood of the Eastern Front, and with the success of this operation, the Third Reich would have a stranglehold over Europe's future. However, even as the gears of war began to turn, the object of Hitler's obsession shifted unexpectedly. Stalingrad, a city on the Volga, had become more than just a strategic waypoint. It was no longer a means to an end, it had become the end itself. For Hitler, it represented more than just a military objective, it was a symbol of Soviet resistance. To capture Stalingrad would be to crush the heart of Soviet power, to strike a fatal blow to Stalin's morale. It was a place of symbolism as much as strategy. Stalingrad had to fall. The Wehrmacht, Germany's military machine, surged forward with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The success of previous campaigns had convinced them of their invincibility. Songs were sung, medals were awarded, and the war seemed all but won. Soldiers, buoyed by the promise of victory, looked to the future with blind faith, certain that they were unstoppable. The Wehrmacht's march into the Soviet Union was marked by a sense of destiny, the army of the master race pushing eastward, bringing order to what Hitler saw as the chaos of Bolshevism. But even among the men who served Hitler, doubts began to surface. The generals, who had been at the helm of previous victories, grew uneasy. They saw the operation's growing scale and the extreme distances that needed to be covered. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, the reality of overextension. The Soviet Union was vast, its resources seemingly endless, and its people more resilient than anticipated. The more ambitious Hitler's plan became, the more it began to resemble overreach. The road to Stalingrad was long, perilous, and fraught with complications. And yet, despite the warnings, the offensive continued. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad only deepened. He dismissed any concerns from his generals, insisting that the city's capture would be the final act of the campaign. "We will destroy the Soviet Union in its very heart," Hitler proclaimed, ignoring the reality of the battle that lay ahead. In his mind, it was already decided, the Wehrmacht would march into Stalingrad, plant the swastika flag, and the Soviet will would be broken. But the confidence that permeated the German ranks could not disguise the growing tension within the ranks. The soldiers, already weary from months of fighting, found themselves stretched thin, their supplies dwindling as they fought to keep their momentum. Generals who had once been celebrated for their decisive victories now whispered among themselves, fearful that the grand operation was pushing them beyond their limits. As the Wehrmacht moved closer to Stalingrad, the reality of the operation began to sink in. The distance between the advancing troops and their supply lines grew longer. The heat of summer, while relentless, was nothing compared to the hell that awaited them in the coming months. Yet, in the fervor of victory, these warnings were pushed aside. The Germans marched on, singing songs of glory, dreaming of their victory, even as they unknowingly marched toward their greatest defeat. The vast steppe stretched endlessly before the advancing German forces, a sea of brown earth that seemed to go on forever. It was here, on this unforgiving landscape, that the panzer divisions rolled forward, their steel treads grinding across the land with a rhythmic certainty. The German war machine, so accustomed to victory, surged forward with unstoppable momentum, each tank and truck a testament to the might of the Wehrmacht. Behind them, the villages of the Soviet Union fell one by one, vanishing in plumes of smoke. The German soldiers, their faces hardened by months of battle, looked on without hesitation as the fires consumed the homes of the people they sought to crush. In their minds, this was not just conquest, it was liberation. The soldiers joked about their march eastward, calling it Christmas in Stalingrad, certain that the city would fall before the first snow of winter. To them, it was another victory, just like the ones they had achieved in Poland, France, and across the Balkans. The Wehrmacht was invincible, they believed, and Stalingrad would be no different. But the march to the Volga was no victory parade. The further the German soldiers advanced into the Russian heartland, the more they felt the weight of their own ambition. The land, at first welcoming, soon began to push back against the invaders. The Russian landscape was unlike anything they had encountered before. The heat of summer was unrelenting, a furnace that sapped their strength day after day. The dust clung to their clothes, to their skin, to their lungs, choking them with every step. Soldiers, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, began to cough and wheeze under the oppressive air. As they pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, they found that the land had a way of consuming them. The vast, barren plains seemed to stretch forever, and the further they went, the more disorienting the journey became. The once immaculate lines of marching soldiers began to break down as exhaustion set in. Men began to collapse from the heat, their boots sinking into the dry earth, unable to move forward. Supplies dwindled, and even the mighty panzer divisions found themselves stalled in the thick, unforgiving dust. Yet the soldiers pressed on, convinced that the end was near. They pushed through fields where the grass burned and the earth itself seemed to rebel against their march. The farther they went, the more isolated they felt. The relentless steppe stretched out on all sides, endless and inhospitable, swallowing them whole. The myth of German invincibility was slowly eroding with every passing mile. They joked to keep morale up. Christmas in Stalingrad, they said, imagining the holiday celebrations they would have when the city fell. It was a fantasy, a comforting illusion that helped them ignore the fact that their enemy was not retreating. The Soviets were digging in, fortifying their defenses, and preparing for the brutal battle to come. But the soldiers of the Wehrmacht could not yet see that the land itself was about to turn against them. The distance between them and Stalingrad began to feel endless, and with each mile, the task ahead grew more daunting. The steppe, which had seemed to promise easy conquest, now felt like an enemy itself. The German advance, once so swift and confident, began to lose its momentum. The farther they pushed, the more alien the landscape became. The cities and villages that once dotted the landscape were now nothing more than ruins, buried under the weight of war. The soldiers could feel the shift in the air. The heat, the dust, the endless horizon, each step forward felt like a weight on their shoulders. And still, they pressed on, convinced that Stalingrad would fall. But the land, the very soil of the Soviet Union, was beginning to shape the battlefield. The Germans were not fighting just the Soviet army, they were fighting the land itself, and it would prove to be a far greater adversary than any they had faced before. As the German divisions crested the last rise, the city of Stalingrad finally came into view, a dark silhouette against the horizon. It stood there, seemingly defiant, its once proud skyline broken and scarred by the violence that had preceded the assault. The city seemed to breathe, a living entity now reduced to a ghost of its former self, its buildings skeletal remains of what they had been just a year earlier. The German soldiers, their eyes trained on the looming fortress ahead, felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. They had come all this way, across the endless steppe, through the blinding heat and choking dust, only to finally encounter the battle that would mark the end of their march. They knew that Stalingrad, the city bearing Stalin's name, would be their final objective in the east. It had become a symbol of Soviet defiance, of Stalin's iron will, and of a victory that Hitler had promised them. But as the soldiers gazed upon the city, they saw something that chilled them to their core. Stalingrad was already a graveyard. The city was not the bustling, thriving urban center they had imagined. Instead, it was a place of ruins, the remnants of buildings that had once been homes, factories, and schools, now reduced to rubble. The streets, once teeming with life, had become a labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered stone. The Soviet defenses were entrenched in these ruins, hidden among the debris, waiting. There was no glamour here, no easy conquest. It was a city already scarred by war, already fighting back, even before the first shot had been fired. Above the city, the sky darkened with the Luftwaffe's heavy bombers. The air was filled with the deep rumble of their engines as they dropped their deadly payloads onto the city below. The bombardment was relentless, designed to break the Soviet defenses before the German infantry could even set foot on the city's streets. The explosions sent plumes of smoke and fire into the sky, and the earth trembled with each impact. From a distance, it was almost beautiful, the firestorms, the rising plumes of black smoke, the earth shaking in the throes of destruction. But for those below, it was nothing but death. The once proud streets of Stalingrad were swallowed by the firestorm. The civilian population, who had lived here for generations, vanished beneath the debris. Men, women, and children were lost in the chaos, their lives extinguished in an instant. For the German soldiers, the sight of this devastation was both reassuring and terrifying. They had come to destroy, but they had not expected such total destruction in return. As the smoke began to clear, the soldiers could see the full extent of the city's transformation. The streets, once lined with homes and businesses, were now barren wastelands, choked with rubble and wreckage. The Soviet defenses, camouflaged within the ruins, began to show themselves. The soldiers caught glimpses of snipers moving from window to window, of machine gun nests nestled in the crumbling walls of destroyed buildings. The Soviet soldiers, hidden in the ruins, were not afraid to fire upon the advancing Germans. This was not just a fight for a city, this was a fight for survival. The Germans had entered not only a battlefield but a graveyard, and in this place, there would be no mercy. As the first German units began to advance into the city's outskirts, they encountered a haunting sight: empty streets, littered with the remnants of civilian life. Abandoned bicycles, shattered windows, and the eerie silence of a city that had been turned into a war zone. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh and smoke, the remnants of bombed-out homes, and the ever-present whisper of death in the wind. The once vibrant city had become a ghost town, a place where even the dead could not rest in peace. The soldiers moved cautiously, their boots crunching through the rubble. The once mighty Volga River, which had provided the lifeblood of the city, now flowed like a silent witness to the carnage unfolding on its banks. The soldiers had heard of the Soviet will, of Stalin's command to never surrender, but they had never encountered a city like this, a city that had already died. They had come for victory, but what they found was something far darker, a hell on earth. On the night of August 23, 1942, the quiet of Stalingrad was shattered by a noise like no other. High above, in the darkened skies, the sound of German aircraft filled the air, an ominous drone that grew louder with each passing moment. It was the beginning of the Luftwaffe's largest aerial assault yet, a bombardment that would transform the city into a hellscape. 1,000 German bombers descended upon the city in waves, their engines howling through the night as they released their deadly payloads. The first explosions were deafening, followed by a cascade of fire and smoke that engulfed everything in its path. The city, already weakened by months of siege and fighting, now faced an onslaught from above. In a single night, the Luftwaffe sought to turn Stalingrad into ash, a final act to break the spirit of the Soviet defenders. The explosions ripped apart entire city blocks, reducing homes, factories, and military posts to charred ruins. Buildings collapsed under the weight of the bombs, and the sky above Stalingrad was painted bright orange, as though the heavens themselves were burning. Fires raged uncontrollably, the intense heat warping the very air, making it almost impossible to breathe. The Volga River, once the lifeblood of the city, seemed to glow with the reflection of the inferno, its surface distorted by the flames. In the chaos below, tens of thousands of people, civilians and soldiers alike, were caught in the violence. Many were consumed by the flames before they could even react. Others were crushed under falling debris, their cries swallowed by the roar of the inferno. The ground shook with the force of each successive explosion, and the smell of burning flesh and timber filled the air. The city of Stalingrad, for all its defiance, was now a furnace, and in that fire, the lives of thousands vanished. As the Luftwaffe pilots returned to base, they celebrated what they believed was a great victory. They had destroyed the heart of the city in a single night, reduced it to rubble, to ash. They had done what no army could accomplish on the ground. In their eyes, this was the final blow. The destruction of Stalingrad was now inevitable, and with it, the collapse of Soviet resistance. Their voices rang with triumph, their medals gleaming in the light of their success. But down below, in the smoke and dust, the Soviet defenders did not bow. The following morning, Soviet radio transmissions were eerily silent. No calls for reinforcements, no requests for medical supplies, just the grim realization that the world was about to change forever. And then, on that day, a voice crackled over the airwaves, Stalin's voice, cold and unyielding. Not one step back. His words were a command, a decree that would echo through the hearts of every Soviet soldier, every civilian trapped in the ruins. The devastation of the night before, the firestorm that had consumed their city, had failed to break their will. Stalin had made it clear, no matter the cost, no matter the suffering, Stalingrad would not fall. They would fight, they would die, but they would not surrender. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe pilots, caught up in their own celebrations, could not have known that the destruction they had wrought would only fuel the Soviet resolve. They thought victory was assured, but in that moment of triumph, they could not see what lay ahead, a battle of survival and retribution unlike any they had ever encountered. As Stalingrad burned, it became clear to the soldiers trapped within that this would not be a war of machines or bombers. This was a war of hearts and minds, a battle for survival, and for Stalingrad itself, an unyielding, burning testament to the strength of the human will. The Don River glistened in the fading light of early morning, its current flowing slowly, carrying with it the whispered echoes of the land's ancient history. To the German Sixth Army, this river was more than just a body of water, it was a line of demarcation, a final barrier before they reached the heart of their mission, Stalingrad. Across its wide, still waters lay the Soviet city they had come to conquer. The soldiers stood on its banks, ready to march forward, convinced that victory was within their grasp. The crossing was meant to be a simple affair, a calculated advance into enemy territory. The Sixth Army had faced countless rivers before, and each time, they had crossed them with ease, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. But the stillness of the dawn, though deceiving, masked the danger ahead. For every step they took towards Stalingrad, the forces of destruction were already in motion, silently preparing to envelop them. The soldiers, in their usual blend of optimism and ignorance, rode home with a sense of certainty that the battle was all but won. Letters were sent back to families, to wives, to mothers, each one filled with the same confident promise: Stalingrad will fall by Christmas. The war will be over soon. We will win, as we always have. The familiar phrases were repeated like a mantra, comforting their loved ones and themselves. They had crossed so many borders, defeated so many enemies, and seen so many cities fall. How could Stalingrad be any different? In their minds, victory was just a matter of time. But as the Sixth Army made its way across the Don, the first hints of disaster began to show themselves. Far from the eyes of the advancing troops, the Soviets had already set their trap. The Russian snipers, silent, unseen, patient, were already entrenched in the ruins of the outlying villages and forests. They watched, calculated, and waited. The Germans, so confident in their strength, had no idea that they were being stalked, one shot at a time, by an enemy that knew how to fight from the shadows. The snipers picked off stragglers, the weak, the wounded, those who failed to keep pace with the rest of the advancing troops. It was a silent massacre, one that would continue for weeks, unseen but felt by every soldier who stepped into the trap. But the snipers were just the beginning. The real danger lay in the Soviet flanks, where entire Soviet armies had silently moved into position, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The encirclement was already forming, slowly, methodically, as Soviet forces crept around the Sixth Army's sides, invisible in the vast Russian wilderness. The Germans, still focused on their forward advance, had no idea that they were being squeezed from both ends, drawn into a ring that would eventually tighten beyond escape. There was quiet dread among the German officers as they surveyed the advancing columns, seeing the familiar horizon and the flat terrain ahead. They told themselves that it would be business as usual, that Stalingrad would fall as easily as every other city had. But the tension in the air was palpable, an undercurrent of unease that even the bravest officers could not shake. Some soldiers felt it too, a sense of something wrong, something just out of reach, something they could not put their finger on. The trap was already set, but it was still concealed beneath the illusion of control. As the soldiers moved further into Soviet territory, the terrain began to change. The dry, cracked earth of the steppe gave way to more rugged land, a landscape of shallow ravines and low hills. The river crossing was just the beginning, and soon, the Germans would find themselves not only facing the Soviet army head-on but also fighting against the land itself, a land that was increasingly becoming inhospitable to their advance. The stillness of the Don was replaced by the eerie quiet of a country that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale with deadly force. But for now, the Germans pushed forward. The illusion of control was still in place, and the soldiers pressed on, convinced that they would soon reach Stalingrad and claim victory. They didn't yet know that the city they sought was already turning into their grave, that the very land beneath their feet was slowly drawing them into a trap from which there would be no escape. The city of Stalingrad had become a living, breathing beast. The streets, once lined with the hum of daily life, now stood silent, ruins of shattered stone, strewn with the remains of buildings that had once housed families, workers, and soldiers. The battle for Stalingrad was not a conventional war of front lines and trenches, it was a war of attrition played out street by street, room by room, as the two armies fought for every inch of the city, as though it were the last piece of land on earth. For the German Sixth Army, this was not the swift, clean conquest they had expected. The city was devouring entire divisions, its narrow streets and close-quarters terrain turning every advance into a nightmare. The soldiers, once so proud and confident, found themselves trapped in a maze of rubble, with no way out but forward. Every corner was a potential ambush, every doorway a deadly gamble. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The city had become a cage, and the soldiers were its prisoners. The German forces, still hoping to push through the city and break the Soviet defenses, soon discovered that the real war was fought in the basements, the sewers, and the charred ruins of burned-out factories. The Soviets had turned the very city against them, using its twisted skeleton as a maze in which they could disappear and strike without warning. Soldiers fought from sewers, emerging like rats to ambush their unsuspecting enemies. They fought from burned factories, hiding behind the remnants of machinery and steel, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every wall, every shattered window became a battleground. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and sweat, the heat of fires and the cold bite of the winter winds. And beneath it all, in the heart of the city, the snipers began their deadly work. The name Vasily Zaitsev became synonymous with the brutal nature of this battle. He was just one of many snipers who had begun their deadly game in the ruins of Stalingrad. But unlike most, he had the uncanny ability to see through the destruction, to find his target amidst the chaos. His rifle was not just a weapon, it was an extension of his will, an instrument of death that would strike down the invaders with a cold, calculated precision. Every Soviet sniper in the city was playing the same deadly game, hunting their German counterparts from hidden vantage points, behind shattered walls, inside the wreckage of bombed-out homes, atop the ruins of the city's great factories. But Zaitsev was different. He had honed his craft during the early days of the war, and he was about to become a legend. He was hunting the hunters, picking off German officers, soldiers, and scouts from a distance, his eyes never leaving the scope, his fingers steady as death. His rifle became the Reaper's scythe, and every shot fired from the shadows meant one less German soldier standing between him and victory. Zaitsev was the epitome of Soviet resolve, and in the depths of Stalingrad, his name spread like wildfire. The rats of Stalingrad had a new leader, a new predator to lead them through the ruins. The fighting grew increasingly claustrophobic. There were no longer any wide-open spaces to maneuver or any clear lines of defense. Each corner brought death, each room brought horror. The battle had become brutal, relentless, a never-ending cycle of violence where soldiers moved like phantoms, each one trying to outlast the other. The city, once a place of life and industry, had now become a graveyard. The soldiers were fighting not for land, not for victory, but simply to survive. In the rubble, every piece of broken brick and every shattered window became a fortress. The walls bled, the very foundations of the city soaking up the blood of its defenders and invaders alike. No soldier, German or Soviet, was safe, not in the streets, not in the homes, not in the factories. As the days wore on, the city seemed to lose its identity. It was no longer Stalingrad. It was a battlefield of death, a place where time had stopped, and the war was all that remained. The echoes of gunfire and explosions reverberated through the streets, the sound of war in a place where the dead and the living mingled. There was no escape from the constant violence, no relief from the never-ending onslaught. The soldiers fought not with honor, but with desperation. They were rats, scrambling for survival, moving through the dark alleys and ruined buildings, always searching for a way out, even as the walls closed in around them. The war of rats had begun in earnest, and there would be no winners in Stalingrad, only survivors. General Friedrich Paulus stood in his war room, his gaze fixed on the maps before him. The lines marking the German advance into Stalingrad had slowed, the expected rapid victory faltering under the weight of Soviet resistance. The German Sixth Army, once confident in their ability to obliterate the city, was now caught in a battle of attrition, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground. Yet Paulus, ever the professional, refused to let his uncertainty show. He was precise, cautious, and above all, loyal. His loyalty to Hitler and the Third Reich had always been unquestionable. Paulus had risen through the ranks as a man of methodical order. He did not believe in wild risks or needless sacrifice, his focus was on strategy and the preservation of his forces. He understood the realities of warfare better than most of his peers. The resources were stretched thin, and the men, weary and starved, were in desperate need of relief. Yet there was something else weighing on him, the city was not falling as planned. The city of Stalingrad, a symbol of Soviet resolve, was turning into the graveyard of his army, and Paulus knew it. As the days passed, the tension between the pragmatic general and the delusions of the Führer became increasingly apparent. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad had transformed the city into more than just a military objective. It had become a symbol of Nazi superiority. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was not simply about securing the oil fields to the south or achieving a military victory. It was a matter of personal pride, of proving to the world that no one could stand in the path of the Third Reich's will. To him, Stalingrad was a sacred city, its capture not just a strategic necessity but a means to deliver a blow to Soviet morale. Hitler's orders were clear: there was to be no retreat. The city, with its name tied to the Soviet leader Stalin, had become a symbol of the war itself. To abandon it would be to show weakness, a sign that the Nazi regime could not claim what was rightfully theirs. And so, Hitler's will became the only truth, and Paulus, despite his growing doubts, had no choice but to comply. But as the weeks wore on and the siege continued, the cost of such obedience became undeniable. Generals, those who had stood beside Paulus in the early days of the war, began to whisper their concerns. The supply lines were stretched thin, food was running out, and reinforcements were a distant hope. The Soviets were encircling them, and every attempt to break free only resulted in heavier losses. There were no victories, only bodies, and the city itself seemed to devour the men who tried to conquer it. The whispers of retreat grew louder among the officers, desperate pleas to pull the Sixth Army out of the hell that had been created. But those pleas fell on deaf ears. Hitler refused to acknowledge defeat. He saw retreat as an act of cowardice, a surrender to Stalin and the Soviet system he so despised. To him, the men trapped in Stalingrad were not merely soldiers, they were part of a greater purpose, one that would define the future of the German people. No, there would be no withdrawal. The Führer had made his decision, and Paulus, despite his personal reservations, was bound to obey. As the fighting grew fiercer, Paulus watched his men grow weaker, their resolve cracking under the strain. His own heart sank as he saw the first signs of desperation among his officers. The German command structure was fracturing, and he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The trap had already been set by the Soviets, but now, the tragedy of obedience was becoming clear. Paulus had never been a man driven by ambition. He had risen to his position not through boldness, but through his loyalty to the cause and his meticulous attention to detail. But that loyalty, once seen as an asset, now seemed like a burden, one that could cost him everything. Logic, the principle that had guided him through his career, was being crushed by Hitler's ego, and the very future of the Sixth Army was in the balance. The tragedy was not just in the loss of the battle, but in the knowledge that Paulus, though a brilliant tactician, was bound by an unwavering loyalty to a man who had no understanding of military reality. His army, his men, were now trapped in a web of ideology, their fate sealed by a leader whose mind had become as unyielding as the stone walls of Stalingrad itself. The seeds of catastrophe had already been sown. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the ground beneath the feet of the German Sixth Army began to tremble, not with the rumble of tanks or the crackle of artillery, but with the silent approach of something far more terrifying, a trap that had been slowly, methodically, set around them. From the north and south, from the frozen wasteland of the Soviet Union, Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, was unleashed with the fury of an unleashed storm. The Sixth Army had been so certain of victory just weeks before. They had been marching confidently into Stalingrad, believing they were on the brink of final triumph. But now, as Soviet troops surged forward from the flanks, the German forces found themselves trapped within an ever-tightening circle of steel. The Soviets had been waiting, watching for the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. The encirclement was so sudden that for the first few hours, the Germans could not comprehend what was happening. A trap that had been set with meticulous patience had been sprung in a blinding flash of violence. Soviet armies, from the north, from the south, and from behind, closed in on the German Sixth Army like the jaws of a giant beast, its teeth made of Soviet tanks, infantry, and artillery. The hunter had now become the hunted. The air, once filled with the roar of German artillery, was now silent except for the distant thunder of Soviet fire. In the German trenches, the first sounds of panic began to rise. Soldiers, who had been certain of victory just days before, now found themselves fighting for their lives. The city of Stalingrad, already a graveyard of dreams, now became the final tomb for the Sixth Army. As the Soviet pincer movements closed in, the Germans began to realize the true scale of the catastrophe. They were not just fighting an enemy. They were trapped in a vast cauldron of death, surrounded on all sides by a force that was neither fatigued nor retreating, but determined and fresh. The Soviets had learned from past mistakes. They were not just pushing the Germans back, they were crushing them. The temperature, which had already begun to plummet in the days before, now dropped below zero. It was as if the very land itself had joined the Soviet offensive, its icy breath freezing the Germans in their tracks. Soldiers huddled together in their trenches, their breath turning to frost in the cold air. The once proud Sixth Army, now trapped, outnumbered, and exhausted, found themselves at the mercy of the Siberian storm. The bitter cold gnawed at their bodies. The tanks, once a symbol of unstoppable power, were now stuck in the frozen mud, their engines sputtering in the frigid air. Communications broke down, and panic spread through the ranks. What had once been a formidable fighting force, invincible in their pride, was now a disorganized, desperate mob. There was no escape. There was no help on the way. The encirclement was complete. The Soviet forces, however, showed no mercy. With precision and determination, they began to tighten the noose. The Germans were cut off from their supply lines, their food, ammunition, and medical supplies dwindling by the hour. What had begun as a brilliant German assault had now turned into a catastrophic strangulation. Operation Uranus was not just a counteroffensive, it was a suffocation. A battle of survival had begun, and the Sixth Army was no longer in control of their fate. In the chaos, in the streets of Stalingrad and the frozen wastelands beyond, men who had once marched with confidence now fought with desperation. The sound of artillery was drowned out by the sound of doom closing in. The air, already thick with smoke and ash, grew colder and more suffocating. Every soldier, every officer, felt the walls closing in. For General Paulus, the realization was as brutal as it was inescapable. The trap had been set, and there was no way out. The illusion of control that had once defined the German advance had dissolved like mist in the early morning sun. The only question left was whether the Sixth Army would break before the final blow came. As the Soviet forces pressed on, a terrible silence descended over the German lines, broken only by the occasional cry of a soldier lost to the cold, to the fight, or to the relentless march of the Soviet advance. There was no more room for heroic speeches, no more room for pride. There was only the cold, the fire, and the realization that Stalingrad would be their tomb. As the days dragged on, the cold became a living, breathing thing. The German Sixth Army, once so confident, so sure of their inevitable victory, found themselves slowly suffocating under the weight of the Soviet encirclement. The realization hit General Paulus like a fist to the gut. They were surrounded. No longer were they advancing toward victory. No longer were they merely fighting the Soviets. Now, they were trapped, ensnared in the steel jaws of the Soviet army, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The message from Berlin was clear, as it had always been: no retreat. Hitler's orders had been precise. But the reality on the ground, the brutal, unforgiving reality, was something far darker than any plan had accounted for. The Sixth Army, 265,000 men, was no longer a conquering force, it was a prison. The moment they crossed the Volga River, they had sealed their own fate. Now, every movement they made was calculated only to survive, to hold on to the shrinking scraps of their once great army. Communications began to collapse almost immediately. Messages from the outer flanks, from the front lines, became garbled or lost altogether. The German radios, once reliable and constant, now failed to make contact. Officers, cut off from their superiors, began to feel the weight of isolation pressing on them. The enemy wasn't just fighting the Germans, they had cut them off, shut them out, and left them to fight in silence, in the frozen wilderness of the Soviet heartland. The supply lines, once the lifeblood of the Sixth Army's advance, were now mere memories. The Germans had been promised reinforcements, airdrops, and relief from the north. But as the days passed, those promises dissolved into dust. The air raids from the Luftwaffe had become sporadic, the supply planes too few, and the frozen conditions made everything, even basic supplies, seem like an impossible dream. Food became scarce, then non-existent. Ammunition ran low. The sick and wounded were left to fend for themselves. Men burned whatever they could find, wooden crates, the last remnants of their equipment, to keep warm, to stave off the bitter cold that gnawed at their bones like a voracious beast. But it wasn't just the cold that was killing them. It was the growing desperation, the knowledge that the end was near, and that they were powerless to stop it. For the soldiers, frostbite replaced fear. Hands, feet, and faces turned black with the advance of frostbite, but there was no time to treat the wounds. Every soldier was fighting to stay alive, battling not only the enemy, but the cold, the hunger, and the disease that followed in the wake of war. By December, the Volga River itself had frozen over, its surface now a silent testament to the suffering of the soldiers. Where once it had been a lifeline, a source of food, supplies, and communication, it was now just another frozen barrier, its current turned into a still, lifeless expanse that separated the Sixth Army from the outside world. As the river froze, so too did any hope of escape. The enemy had already closed in from every direction, and now the weather, the very land itself, had sealed them in. The men of the Sixth Army were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting simply to survive another day. The Soviet forces, like a dark cloud that had been slowly gathering, were now closing in with terrifying precision. Snipers, machine gun nests, and artillery rained down from every angle. There was nowhere to retreat to, nowhere to hide. The city of Stalingrad, once a symbol of Soviet resistance, had become a death trap for the German invaders. Paulus, surrounded by his officers in the war room, stared at the maps laid before him. The lines that once represented German dominance were now disintegrating, and the reality of his situation began to sink in. The dream of victory had long since vanished, replaced by the grim certainty that his army was doomed. His soldiers were dying, some from the cold, others from the constant bombardment. The city, its ruins now crumbling under the weight of war, was about to claim the last remnants of the Sixth Army. The silence in the war room was broken only by the sound of distant artillery, the thunderous rhythm of doom closing in. Paulus knew that he could not hold out much longer. The soldiers under his command, once proud and confident, had now become ghosts, lost in the ruins of a city that had consumed their lives. The battle for Stalingrad was not just a fight for land, it had become a fight for survival in a frozen hell, with no way out. By late November 1942, the Sixth Army was no longer just fighting a battle, they were fighting for survival. The city of Stalingrad, once the bold target of their advance, had become a deadly snare, drawing the German forces in ever closer with each passing hour. The Soviets had turned the tables, and now, like a vengeful beast, they were closing in. The ring of Soviet forces tightened slowly, relentlessly, until the German Sixth Army was surrounded on all sides. The German soldiers, their nerves already fraying from months of battle, now found themselves in a living nightmare, a frozen hell, where every movement forward only brought them closer to destruction. The city, once bustling with the fervor of conquest, now echoed only with the sounds of death, the incessant crack of Soviet artillery, the shriek of bombs, the eerie silence of soldiers caught between the jaws of an enemy they could no longer escape. Outside the city, the German relief forces, which had been promised as a final hope, now found themselves struggling against insurmountable odds. Operation Winter Storm, the mission to break through and relieve the encircled army, was already proving to be a fantasy, an impossible dream. The Soviets had anticipated this and were waiting. Their forces had spread out, not just to encircle the city but to block any hope of a German breakthrough. The pincer movement had been executed with terrifying efficiency, and the Sixth Army was now completely cut off, isolated, and surrounded. The soldiers within Stalingrad could still hear the distant rumble of German tanks from outside the encirclement, but these sounds grew more distant with every passing day. What had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like a mirage, far out of reach, slipping further and further away as the winter deepened. The Luftwaffe had promised airdrops of food, ammunition, and medical supplies to the trapped soldiers, but the reality was far more grim. The freezing conditions and relentless Soviet anti-aircraft fire turned the skies into a deadly gauntlet, and each supply plane that tried to break the Soviet siege was either shot down or forced to turn back before reaching its target. The promise of relief from the air was nothing but empty words, swallowed by the ice and fire of war. The men trapped in Stalingrad had little more than their determination to keep them going. They were frozen, their faces and hands raw from frostbite, their bellies hollow with hunger. But still, they held fast, not because they believed in victory, but because they had no other choice. Hitler's orders had been clear, there was to be no surrender. Not one step back had been Stalin's decree, and now, for the Germans, it was the same. They had no path of retreat, no escape. The walls were closing in, the air growing thinner with each breath they took. The Soviet forces, both frontline infantry and elite troops, were now closing in on all sides. The Germans could feel the weight of inevitability with every passing hour. The endless blizzards and freezing temperatures only added to the sense of suffocating isolation. The once great Sixth Army was now a trapped animal, surrounded by enemies in the elements, their only companions the cold and the sound of artillery in the distance. Every soldier knew that escape was no longer possible, that they were left to die in the ruins of a city that had become their tomb. Outside the ring, German generals scrambled to form a rescue plan. They pored over maps, strategized with grim determination, but every attempt was thwarted by the sheer scale of the Soviet resistance. Winter Storm, the operation meant to break the siege, was struggling from the start. The distance between the relief forces and Stalingrad, compounded by the ferocious Soviet counterattacks, turned the operation into a distant hope, a hope that faded with every passing day. The Germans were now fighting a battle on two fronts, one in the streets of Stalingrad and the other in the endless expanse of the Soviet wilderness. Inside the encirclement, men began to question their purpose. Were they trapped to fight or simply to die? The morale had crumbled, and the city's ruins had become a final resting place, not just for the dead but for the living as well. Each soldier had his own way of coping with the isolation. Some dreamed of home, others of escape. But deep in their hearts, they all knew the same truth: they were alone, isolated, and the suffocating grip of the Soviet encirclement was closing tighter with every hour. General Friedrich Paulus sat in the darkness of his command post, the faint flicker of candles casting long shadows against the cold, crumbling walls. His hands, stiff with frostbite, gripped the maps in front of him, though his mind was far from the intricate lines and symbols on the paper. Outside, the howling winds of winter had transformed Stalingrad into a dead city, and yet inside the general's headquarters, the silent tension was even more suffocating. For weeks now, Paulus had been fighting not only the Soviets but also the mounting weight of his own conscience. The orders came from Berlin, from Hitler: stand firm, no retreat. These words, once so familiar, now felt like chains. Each time he read them, they seemed to dig deeper into his chest, strangling any hope of escape. No retreat. That phrase echoed in his head, each syllable a sentence, sealing the fate of the men under his command. Outside the walls of his headquarters, the Sixth Army was crumbling. The soldiers, once strong and confident, were now mere shadows of their former selves, their faces gaunt from hunger, their bodies frozen by the bitter cold. The sound of distant artillery was ever present, a constant reminder that the Soviet forces were tightening their grip. The Soviets had cut off the supply lines, and the once great Wehrmacht was now reduced to surviving day by day, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Paulus knew the truth: his army was lost. The encirclement was complete, and there was no escape. He could hear the desperate whispers of his officers, their voices tinged with panic, asking if they should continue fighting or surrender. But Paulus, bound by his duty and his loyalty to the Führer, could not give them the answer they needed. He had been trained for war, for strategy, for victory, but never for this. Never for a battle without hope. The walls of his headquarters were closing in, the air thick with the stench of sweat, smoke, and despair. The faint smell of burning wood hung in the air as soldiers scrounged for any bit of fuel they could find, burning anything that could provide warmth. But there was no warmth for Paulus. His mind was frozen, trapped between the world of his duty and the crushing reality that victory was no longer possible. His eyes drifted to the letters from home, letters from his wife and children, filled with stories of life outside the war. A life that seemed so far away, so irrelevant now. He had once believed in the cause, in the purpose of the Third Reich, but the men around him, the soldiers fighting for their lives in the streets, had started to lose faith. How could they not? The supply drops had failed, the promised relief from the north had never arrived, and now the city itself had become a tomb. His own silence had become a burden. The weight of 250,000 lives pressed down on him, heavier than any battlefield. His officers looked to him for guidance, but all he could offer was silence, the kind of silence that comes when the weight of responsibility becomes too much to bear. He felt as though the blood of the soldiers was on his hands, even though he had not ordered them to fight to the death. Yet, in some way, he had. He had made the decision to stand firm, and now those soldiers were dying, day by day, hour by hour. The crackling of the radio startled him from his thoughts. A new message had arrived, the voice on the other end cold, mechanical, offering no comfort, no hope, just more orders. "Hold your position," the voice commanded. "Victory is within reach." Victory? How could they still speak of victory? Paulus had seen the death and destruction around him. He had heard the screams of men frozen in the streets, their bodies unable to move, too weak to fight back. He had seen his soldiers disintegrate into ghosts, their once proud uniforms now nothing more than rags. Yet, still, the orders came. And still, he obeyed. No retreat. Outside, the temperature plummeted further, and the men inside the bunker huddled together for warmth. Frostbitten fingers struggled to write out responses to the headquarters. The air was thick, and the silence between the officers was a silent scream. Paulus' mind had begun to fracture, the psychological tension growing unbearable. What had once seemed like duty now felt like an inexorable march toward doom. His every thought, every decision, felt like a step into the abyss. Logic, the foundation of his career, had been overwhelmed by ego, by the frenzied will of Hitler. The Soviet artillery outside boomed louder, the ground shaking with each new explosion. Inside the bunker, the men did their best to ignore the sounds of war that were creeping closer. The light from the candles flickered like the last vestiges of hope, dying slowly in the cold, the flames never bright enough to warm the hearts of the men who still believed in something that no longer existed. General Hermann Göring had promised victory from the skies. He had assured Hitler and the rest of the command staff that the Luftwaffe would keep the Sixth Army supplied, would lift them from the depths of their encirclement. 300 tons of supplies per day, that was the promise, the figure that everyone had clung to in their darkest hours. The Luftwaffe, with its impressive fleet of bombers and transport planes, would be the savior, the lifeline that would keep the Germans alive until relief came. But the reality was much darker, and far more crushing. The Soviets had anticipated the aerial supply route, and every passing day made it clearer that the air bridge had become more of a curse than a salvation. The planes that had once delivered death to the Soviet forces were now carrying desperate cargo to the Sixth Army, but they weren't delivering the needed supplies. Instead, they carried cold bodies, frozen corpses stacked in the fuselage like empty cargo, shipped off to their final resting place. Each plane that took off from German-held territory was a gamble. The skies were no longer clear and open, they were filled with Soviet fighters eager to tear apart any German aircraft that dared to approach the trapped city. The snowstorm that blanketed the region made navigation impossible, and the weight of winter seemed to crash down on both the planes and the men waiting below. It was a relentless cycle, a seemingly hopeless endeavor to bring aid that never arrived in any meaningful form. Of the promised 300 tons, barely 60 tons made it to the ground. 60, and only a fraction of that was food, ammunition, or medical supplies. The rest was the cold, the empty, frozen shells of what had once been men, carried like ghosts from the skies, delivered to die. The Luftwaffe pilots, once so confident in their might, were now trapped in the same hopelessness they had inflicted on others. The planes flew on, engines sputtering, wings shuddering against the cold air, only to be shot down one by Soviet defenses. Even when the planes managed to reach the city, landing them was another impossible task. The runways were destroyed, and the snow piled up so high that many planes were forced to land in the most dangerous, makeshift conditions. There were no cheers for the arrival of the planes, only the heavy silence of men who knew that these deliveries would not be enough. The cargo was gone before it was unloaded, and what remained was nothing but cold metal and dead flesh. The air bridge that had once been a symbol of hope was now a graveyard in the sky. The planes that made it past Soviet fire returned with fewer and fewer supplies, their fuselages a testament to the futility of the operation. The sky, once clear and proud, now seemed like the great enemy itself, a barrier between the Sixth Army and their only chance at survival. The engines of the planes had once carried the sound of power and authority, but now they were just another part of the relentless repetition that echoed through the blizzards. The sound of engines fading into the howling winds became a cruel reminder that the promise of salvation was a fantasy, and no amount of aircraft could bring it to life. Each crash was another soul lost, another hope shattered. The men below, already surviving on little more than their will to endure, could only watch as the planes disappeared into the white void, knowing they were alone in the frigid silence. The Luftwaffe's gamble had failed, and the men inside Stalingrad were now left with only the bitter reality of their situation. The air bridge, like so many of the promises made to them, had become a cruel mockery. What had once been a lifeline had turned into a ghost story, a fading echo in the white hell that had become their world. As the days turned into weeks, the German Sixth Army found themselves caught in a nightmare more terrible than any they had ever faced. The frozen hell of Stalingrad was no longer just a battleground, it had become an unrelenting force that sought to consume them whole. Hunger and cold gnawed at the soldiers, turning once proud men into shadows of their former selves. The food supply had long since run out. The frozen corpses of the horses that had once pulled their supply wagons now lay in the streets, slaughtered for the last scraps of meat they could offer. But even the meat was not enough to sustain them. The men had started boiling the boots they had once worn into battle, trying to extract the last bit of nourishment from the leather and the soles. The taste was nothing more than the bitter reminder of their desperation. As the days wore on and the Soviets tightened their grip, the soldiers' hope began to evaporate. What had started as a war for glory had now become a battle for survival. With every passing hour, their bodies grew weaker. The snow, which had once been nothing more than a backdrop to the fighting, had now become their enemy. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience, it was devouring them. It crept into their bones, turning their limbs numb, and leaving them too weak to even hold their rifles steady. In the night, the soldiers tried to sleep, but the cold wouldn't allow it. They huddled together for warmth, their breath crystallizing in the freezing air. The ground beneath them, once solid earth, was now frozen, an unyielding, unforgiving surface that refused to give them comfort. The men began to eat whatever they could find. Some turned to snow, scraping it from the ground, hoping that the ice would fill their stomachs, though they knew it would only freeze them further. Others resorted to candle wax, swallowing it in desperate hope that the warmth from their stomachs would somehow hold the cold at bay. But nothing helped. It was only a temporary relief, a sickly comfort that kept their bodies moving even as their spirits began to wither. In the dim light of their freezing bunkers, the men wrote letters home. But these letters were no longer filled with stories of courage and hope. Instead, they became confessions, bitter, honest admissions of what they had become. They spoke of hunger, of cold, of the death that was closing in. They spoke of a city that had become a tomb, and of the strange, quiet realization that they were no longer fighting for a cause, but simply trying to stay alive long enough to see the war's end. But the end never seemed to come. The Soviet artillery continued to pound the city, the shells falling like clockwork, shaking the ground beneath them. And the men, exhausted, starving, frozen, could only wait. They no longer had the strength to fight, but they still clung to the hope that something would come to save them. The Luftwaffe's airdrops were a distant memory, their supply lines cut off, and the walls of their encirclement grew tighter with every passing hour. Outside the city, the dead began to pile up, too frozen to bury, too cold to mourn. The soldiers left them where they fell, their bodies half frozen, their faces locked in an eternal expression of agony. The men could no longer even bury their comrades. There was no time, no energy, no tools, just a city filled with the silent witnesses of war, each body frozen in place, awaiting the end. The officers, once the proud leaders of the 6th Army, now faced their men with hollow eyes, their faces gaunt and weary. They had no orders, no direction, only the empty sound of Soviet artillery and the relentless howl of the wind. The soldiers, too weak to fight back, would often stare off into the distance, lost in thoughts of home, of their families, of the lives they had left behind. But the snow, the cold, and the hunger had swallowed everything, and the only thing that remained was the slow, inevitable decay of the body and the spirit. The city had become a wasteland, a place where humanity could no longer survive. The Soviet forces, ever present and ever encroaching, seemed to be the only thing alive. The men of the 6th Army had been reduced to nothing more than survivors, a broken, starving, frozen remnant of a once proud fighting force. And as they huddled together, waiting for the inevitable end, there was only the sound of death in the snow, creeping ever closer. Inside the frozen ruins of their headquarters, the soldiers of the 6th Army huddled around radios, their once strong bodies now gaunt, weakened by hunger, frostbite, and the never-ending barrage from the Soviet forces. The only lifeline they had left, the one thing that could reach them from the outside world, was the static-filled voice of German radio. Every day, Berlin sent messages, proclamations of victory that seemed more like a fantasy than a reality. Victory is near, the broadcasts promised. Relief forces are on the way. Hold fast. The end of Soviet resistance is imminent. The soldiers listened, their faces hollow, eyes glazed with exhaustion and disbelief, yet they still clung to the broadcasts, unable to let go of the faint hope they offered. The words were empty. Everyone in the Sixth Army could feel the lies smothering them, but it didn't matter. The lie had become their comfort. It was the one thing that kept them going, the thin thread that tied their will to the fading illusion of victory. They had nothing left except these promises from the radio, promises that rang hollow and muffled beneath the rumble of Soviet artillery and the roar of the wind that cut through the city's remains. But beneath the surface of official propaganda, the soldiers began to search for truth in other places. Some of them, in desperate defiance, would secretly tune their radios to Russian frequencies, the forbidden waves that carried news from the other side of the front. They heard the cold, steady voice of Soviet commanders, the broadcasts filled with warnings and instructions to the Soviet soldiers, urging them to tighten the noose. The reality of their situation, the encirclement, the starvation, the frostbite, became unmistakable as the voices from Moscow echoed over the airwaves. For a brief moment, they were no longer isolated within the German war machine. They heard the truth of their plight. Stalingrad was lost, and with it, their future. The Soviet broadcasts were clear: we are pushing the Germans back. The Sixth Army is surrounded and will be destroyed. No retreat. Victory is ours. There was no pretension in their words, no attempt to disguise the truth. The Soviets spoke of their encirclement with grim certainty, and the trapped Germans could hear the finality in those words. The Sixth Army was not the conqueror, it was the conquered. They were not part of a glorious offensive, they were fodder, soldiers sacrificed for a cause that had failed before it had even begun. But even with this knowledge, even with the truth so clear on the other side of the radio, General Paulus could not bring himself to listen to it. In his headquarters, far removed from the battlefield, he listened to both the German and Soviet broadcasts, weighed their words in the frozen stillness of his command post, but found himself believing neither. The German broadcasts promised hope, promised victory, promised a future he could no longer see. The Soviet broadcasts told him the grim truth of the encirclement, the reality that his army was done, his men dead or dying, and the city lost. But in his mind, the truth was unbearable. It was something he could not accept. The lie that came from the radio every day became his escape, the thin veil of comfort that allowed him to endure the constant pressure, the psychological collapse of his men, and the growing hunger and despair. If he faced the truth, he would lose everything: the will to fight, the hope to survive. The lie gave him something to hold on to, something that kept him from falling into the abyss. The truth, as he knew, was not something he could give to his men. If he acknowledged it aloud, it would shatter them entirely. The soldiers who still clung to life, whose eyes searched the sky for the planes that never arrived, would lose everything. The radio, with its empty promises, was the only thing they had left. To accept the truth would mean the end, not just of the battle, but of everything they had fought for. As the snow fell heavier outside, covering the city in a blanket of white, the men of the Sixth Army sat in their cold bunkers, clutching their radios like a lifeline to the world that seemed so far away. The sound of the Russian artillery was now a permanent background hum in their ears, as constant as the breath in their chests. And still, the voice on the radio, the one from Berlin, spoke of victory, spoke of success, even as the men were slowly dying in the streets of Stalingrad. The loneliness of the truth was deafening, but the comfort of the lie was all they had. The news came as a fleeting whisper, barely a flicker of hope in the suffocating dark of Stalingrad. General Field Marshal Manstein, one of the few remaining figures of authority in the German high command, had launched a last-ditch effort to break through the Soviet encirclement, Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. The operation promised to be the salvation, the final attempt to relieve the Sixth Army from its frozen prison. There was talk of tanks, elite infantry, and the unstoppable might of the Wehrmacht coming from the north, breaking the Soviet lines and lifting the siege from the suffering city. For the men trapped in the pocket, this was the final light in their world of darkness. At first, there was hope. As the distant sounds of gunfire grew louder, the soldiers in Stalingrad clung to the belief that the relief was at hand. The men in the trenches, starved and frostbitten, hearing the rumble of artillery, could almost taste the rescue. Their hearts stirred, and for a moment, the thick veil of despair lifted. They cheered, weakly, but they cheered, believing that the long nightmare was nearing its end. Could it be? Were the Germans finally coming to save them? But as the distant rumblings grew louder, the sobering truth began to settle in. Wintergewitter, the relief operation, was being fought miles away from the city. The Soviets, waiting patiently for this desperate push, struck back with everything they had. The rumble of gunfire, once so promising, faded back into the vast wilderness of the Soviet defenses. The relief column was halted in its tracks, crushed by Soviet counterattacks, its forces shattered by the brutal winter conditions and the overwhelming numbers of Soviet soldiers. The dream of rescue collapsed as quickly as it had come. For the men trapped within the encirclement, the silence that followed was suffocating. The faint echo of battle that had given them hope now gave way to the harsh, bleak reality of defeat. Operation Wintergewitter had failed. The Sixth Army was alone, and Stalingrad, like a colossal tomb, seemed to swallow them whole. The faith they had clung to now turned to numbness. It was no longer about fighting for victory, it was about surviving one more day. Inside the pocket, the men's spirits, already broken by hunger, cold, and isolation, now dissolved into an emptiness that no command could fill. The front lines were no longer just about the Soviet soldiers coming at them from every angle, they were about the growing realization that the war they had fought for was no longer real. There would be no victory here. There would be no rescue. There was only the city, its walls closing in, its ruins turning to graves. The Sixth Army, once the epitome of German might, now moved like shadows through the streets of Stalingrad. The frozen earth beneath them seemed to mock their existence, their once proud uniforms now rags, their faces hollowed out from hunger and despair. They had been abandoned, by their commanders, by their country, and by the very war machine that had once promised them glory. They had been left to rot in the icy embrace of Stalingrad, their fate sealed in the frozen labyrinth of ruins that had once been a thriving city. As the Soviets tightened their grip, Paulus sat in the darkness of his command post, the radio silent. The reality of the failed relief attempt had already sunk in. His men were no longer just fighting to hold the city, they were fighting for survival, each man reduced to nothing more than an animal scrambling for warmth, for food, for anything to keep him alive for one more hour. The long winter had now become an eternity, and each breath taken in the bitter air was a reminder that the walls were closing in. By the time the winter of 1942 truly set in, Stalingrad had become something more than a battlefield, it had become a test of survival against the harshest forces nature could unleash. The German Sixth Army, already battered by the constant Soviet pressure and ravaged by hunger, was now fighting an even more insidious enemy, the brutal Russian winter. The temperature, which had already been dropping steadily, now plunged to an unimaginable -40 degrees Celsius. The air felt thick with cold, each breath a sharp sting in the lungs. Snow blanketed the city, turning the ruins of Stalingrad into a frozen wasteland, every building, every street, a silent tomb. What little light there was reflected off the icy rubble, casting long, ghostly shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Nature, once something that had been an ally to the Germans, had turned against them, becoming just as deadly as the Soviet forces they faced. Frostbite spread like wildfire, faster than any disease, claiming men by the dozens. Soldiers' fingers and toes, once vital for holding rifles and throwing grenades, now froze solid, turning dark purple and black. Some men could not even feel the cold anymore, the flesh simply lost all sensation, and then, like a cruel joke, it began to rot away. There were no doctors, no treatment, just the quiet suffering of men who had no choice but to carry on, their bodies slowly turning into corpses while they still lived. The weapons, once the proud tools of the Wehrmacht's superiority, now became useless. Guns froze in place, their bolts sticking and seizing as soldiers tried to fire them against the Soviet assault. The cold had stripped their efficiency, and fuel, once a lifeline for their tanks, turned into solid blocks of ice. Even the engines of their vehicles, frozen beyond repair, became immobile relics of a failed effort. Yet, it was not just the men who were at the mercy of the frozen hell. Even the very blood flowing through their veins was affected. It was as though the city itself had conspired with the winter to make them surrender. Blood crystallized in their veins, turning to ice within their own bodies. The pain of frostbite was only the beginning. The bodies of the soldiers, weakened by hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion, couldn't handle the extreme cold, and many simply collapsed, never to rise again. The battlefield had become a graveyard, and the frozen air had taken over their bodies before they could even recognize it. In the distance, the Volga River flowed, its surface now a mirror of the frozen sky above. Once a symbol of life, the river had now turned into a silent witness to the carnage unfolding within the city. It lay still and motionless, its surface gleaming like polished steel, a frozen grave beneath the men who had once relied on it for survival. The sound of its flow, which had once been a comforting presence for the residents of Stalingrad, now seemed absent, lost in the stillness, like the hopes of the soldiers trapped within the encirclement. The city's ruins were no longer just a battlefield, they were tombstones, cast in ice, each corner and alleyway marking another failed attempt to escape the inevitable fate. The sound of Soviet artillery seemed muffled in the cold, the explosions distant echoes in a world turned to silence. Each blast that rumbled through the streets only added to the frozen atmosphere, as though even the air itself was bearing witness to the death unfolding. The soldiers who had once marched with certainty through the streets of Stalingrad now trudged like ghosts, their footsteps lost in the deep snow, their faces hollow with exhaustion. For many, it was no longer about victory, it was about survival, about holding on until the end, whenever it came. The Soviets had turned the war into a test of endurance, and nature had conspired to make sure that they would be broken by the time it was over. The walls of Stalingrad had long since ceased to echo with the sounds of defiance. Now, in the quiet of the frozen ruins, there were only whispers, the hushed voices of soldiers who knew the end was near. Inside their crumbling bunkers and trenches, the Sixth Army had fallen silent. No longer were there dreams of victory, no plans for a bright future. The battle was over for them. The hope that had once driven them forward had been replaced by the stark reality of their situation, trapped, starved, and frozen, with no way out. And so, as the days wore on, the soldiers began to write letters home, but not to tell of their triumphs or their successes. These were no longer letters of victory or glory. They were farewell notes, written in the dead of night, by the light of a single flickering candle. Some addressed mothers, others to wives or children, but many were addressed to no one at all, just empty words, drifting out into a world that would never receive them. The letters were simple. They told stories of cold, of hunger, of the exhaustion that had worn away their will to fight. Some asked for forgiveness, others offered love and apologies, while a few spoke of the simple longing for home, a place they would never see again. Each word was written with the knowledge that it would likely never be read. The men who wrote them were already dying, either from the frozen bite of the weather or from the long, slow death of hope that had taken root in their hearts. The letters, often written in moments of quiet desperation, became their final act of humanity. Some soldiers hid their letters beneath the snow or buried them deep in the walls of the ruined buildings, hoping that one day, someone would find them, perhaps a century later, and read the words of those who had been forgotten by the world. Those letters would be their legacy, the last record of men who had once believed in the cause, but who, in the end, had been swallowed by the abyss of war. These words, preserved by the ice of the Russian winter, would survive the men who wrote them, carefully kept for generations that would never know their authors. The letters spoke of despair, yes, but they also held small flickers of humanity, the last remnants of a spirit that could still feel. Even in the darkest hours, with death looming over them, there were moments of tenderness, of love that had not yet been extinguished. Some men wrote to their mothers, apologizing for the pain they had caused, others to their wives, promising that they would return, despite knowing that those promises would never be kept. The letters were all they had left, a final attempt to hold on to something human in a place that had long since turned into a graveyard. As the soldiers trudged through the ruins, freezing and starved, their thoughts often turned to their families, their homes, and their lives before the war. They thought of the letters they had written long ago, letters filled with hope, filled with promises that they would make it through, that this war would be just another chapter in the history of the Third Reich's inevitable victory. Now, those letters had turned into goodbye notes, the final, empty promises of men who had long since lost their way. In the aftermath of the battle, the letters were found. Buried beneath the snow or hidden in the walls of ruined homes, they had remained untouched, preserved by the cold and the silence that had consumed the city. Some of the letters were read, others were lost, but each one served as a testament to the tragedy of Stalingrad. These soldiers, caught between the brutal realities of war and the fragility of life, had left behind a record of their final thoughts, their last flickers of humanity before they were extinguished in the icy hell of the battle. The men who had written those letters were now gone, but their words lived on, preserved in the snow, their final messages etched into history. They were the voices of those who had given everything, yet received nothing in return, their dreams and hopes buried forever beneath the weight of Stalingrad's ruins. As the German Sixth Army faced its final days in Stalingrad, the bitter winds of winter cut deeper than any enemy shell ever could. The soldiers, already half-starved, frozen to the bone, and isolated in a city that had become their tomb, turned inward in search of something, anything, to hold on to. And in the face of such unimaginable suffering, many turned to faith, though in Stalingrad, even faith seemed to wither and die under the oppressive weight of the frozen hell around them. The chaplains, once men of hope, were now little more than hollow figures, standing by the firing squads, their prayers a ritual that had long since lost its meaning. They were not here to offer salvation, they were simply witnesses to the end. Their prayers, muttered beside the cold bodies of men who had been executed for desertion or simply to make room for those who were still alive, rang hollow in the wind. These men, who had once preached of eternal life, now found themselves standing amidst a city of death, with no promise of salvation to offer. For the soldiers trapped in the city, the absence of hope was so profound that they began to hallucinate. The cold had driven them beyond the threshold of sanity, and they began to dream of warmth, of comfort, of things they could never touch. Some soldiers, huddled together in the ruins, would suddenly close their eyes, whispering that they could hear music, the strains of a song they had once known in their youth, a song that seemed to call them home. For a brief moment, they imagined they were back in Germany, standing in the sun, free of the cold and the suffering. But when they opened their eyes, the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad greeted them, and the music vanished, leaving only the hollow sound of Russian artillery and the moans of the dying. Yet, some still clung to the illusion, lost in a feverish haze. They spoke of forgiveness, of a world that would be set right once they crossed into the afterlife. Their minds had cracked, and in those broken fragments, they found solace, even if it was a delusion. Others, however, met the city's final days with something far darker. Laughter, a dry, hollow laughter, echoed through the ruined streets. It was a laugh that held no joy, but rather a sense of madness, a recognition that they were now beyond redemption, trapped in a place where even God had abandoned them. Some soldiers stared into the endless gray sky above, their faces frozen in twisted grins, laughing bitterly at the irony of it all. They believed, for a brief, insane moment, that even God had frozen, that the divine had turned its face away from them, leaving them to face Stalingrad's madness alone. The city, once a place of life, had now become a cathedral of ghosts. The ruins, scarred by fire and bullet holes, were silent, save for the echoes of the dying and the madness that had taken root in the hearts of the men who still wandered through the wreckage. Every shattered building, every fallen column, was a monument to the dead, the forgotten souls who had once believed in something greater than themselves. The city itself, a shell of its former self, now seemed to hold the bodies and spirits of its lost inhabitants. Every corner of the ruins whispered the same chilling message: there was no more hope. There was only death, and the empty prayers that clung to the air like a fading smoke. And yet, even as the last of the men fought to hold on to some semblance of faith, the Soviets pressed their attack. The encirclement was complete. The sky above was no longer just a symbol of the heavens, but a cold, indifferent expanse that offered no answer to the suffering below. The snow continued to fall, and with it, any last shred of hope, any last cry for mercy, was buried in the frost. The soldiers no longer prayed for victory or survival, they simply prayed for peace, an end to the suffering that had consumed them. The city had turned into a shrine to the damned, a place where all illusions, whether of God, of glory, or of victory, had dissolved into the freezing night. There was nothing left but the slow death that had been sealed when they first entered the gates of Stalingrad. As the days stretched on, the harsh winter deepened its grip on the Sixth Army, and the reality of their situation grew more inescapable. General Friedrich Paulus sat in the darkness of his command post, his mind consumed by the weight of a decision he had no choice but to make. The city of Stalingrad, once a symbol of Nazi ambition, was now little more than a graveyard, its streets littered with the dead and the dying. His men, once full of the vigor of conquest, were now nothing more than shadows, emaciated and frostbitten, clinging to life in the ruins of the city. The Soviets had them surrounded, their relief forces had failed, and the city was slipping away, piece by piece, into the abyss. But there was still the matter of the orders. The radio crackled with an ominous message from Berlin, the voice of Hitler. "Paulus, you have been promoted to Field Marshal." The words were cold, distant, and lacked any true warmth. No German Field Marshal has ever surrendered. It was clear. The message was unmistakable. Victory or death, there was no room for retreat, no space for mercy, no consideration of survival. Paulus had been elevated to the highest rank possible, a field marshal, but with that promotion came a curse. Surrender was now unthinkable, for to surrender would bring damnation not only upon himself, but upon the entire German war effort. He was now trapped in a web of honor that had been spun by Hitler's ego, a web that had no escape. Paulus, once a man known for his careful, methodical approach to warfare, now stood at a precipice, looking into the eyes of his men who had become shadows of their former selves. Starved, frostbitten, and weakened, they looked to him not as their leader, but as their last hope. His officers, too, had their eyes fixed on him, waiting for him to make the decision that would either end their suffering or condemn them all. For a moment, Paulus wondered if surrender could be an option. He looked into the eyes of his soldiers, eyes that had once been full of confidence, now clouded with exhaustion and despair. He thought of the faces of the men who had followed him, some of whom were no longer even capable of standing, their bodies shriveled by starvation and cold. But even as the thought of surrender flickered in his mind, the weight of Hitler's words crushed it, sealing his fate. Obedience had become his prison. The weight of his duty was too great to allow him to consider any other option. The field marshal's uniform that had once symbolized power now felt like chains, binding him to a cause that had already been lost. To surrender would be to betray the very cause that had brought him here, and in doing so, he would become another failure in the eyes of Hitler and the Nazi regime. And so, he remained silent. The end was near, and Paulus knew that his choice, whether to fight to the last man or to order a surrender, would decide the fate of his soldiers. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of crackling radio static. His officers sat in tense stillness, waiting for his response, their faces pale and drawn. There was no victory left to be had, no grand triumph. The only question that remained was how they would die, whether they would die fighting in the streets of Stalingrad or succumb to the frozen grip of hunger and frost. The burden of command had never been heavier. Paulus felt the walls of his mind closing in. He knew that the promise of victory was nothing but a lie, and that the only path forward was one that led to destruction. The Sixth Army was already defeated, the trap already set, and all that remained was the final act. But the decision to give in to the reality of that defeat, to give up the fight and allow his men to surrender, was something that Paulus could not bring himself to do. His mind, once sharp and logical, was now clouded with the weight of his duty. The Führer had spoken, and the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed in the cold silence of obedience. It was January 1943 when the final act of Stalingrad's tragedy began. The city, already a graveyard for both the living and the dead, now faced its last assault, a relentless, unyielding barrage that would mark the end of the German Sixth Army's existence within its frozen walls. The Soviet artillery opened fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the night was immediately swallowed by thunder. The sky above seemed to bleed with the rising explosions, the earth itself shaking under the weight of heavy bombardments. Every shell that fell on the German positions carried with it the finality of death, and the city itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm of inevitability, a countdown to extinction. The sound of the artillery was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out all other noise, filling the ears of the soldiers with a maddening repetition. Explosions echoed across the ruins, each one erasing another inch of what remained of the city, each one inching the Sixth Army closer to total annihilation. What little resistance the Germans had left was obliterated by the relentless fire, and their positions, once held with pride and determination, collapsed one by one under the weight of Soviet firepower. Inside the ruins, the Sixth Army could do little to fight back. The supply lines had long been cut, the ammunition depleted. The tanks and weapons that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht had turned into frozen husks, useless in the face of the advancing Soviet forces. The men who had once proudly worn their uniforms now fought with whatever they could find, knives, shovels, and their bare hands. The air was thick with the scent of blood, of death, as the Germans fought with desperation, knowing full well that they were no longer fighting for victory, but for the chance to die with some semblance of honor. As the Soviets continued their advance, the cold became another enemy, an inhuman force that muffled the cries of the dying. The soldiers' screams were swallowed by the ice, as if the frozen ground itself had decided to silence their pain. Frostbite claimed the weakest, their limbs turning black and stiff, while the cold gnawed at their bones, making every movement a struggle. Their bodies, too exhausted to fight, grew numb to the pain, each soldier marching toward their end in a dead stupor. The barrage continued, relentless, unforgiving. The German positions, though fortified and entrenched, could no longer withstand the weight of the Soviet advance. The men inside the city were now nothing more than shadows, broken, starved, and frozen, but the fight for survival still burned inside them. They fought not for victory, but for the right to die on their feet, not in the mud and blood of Stalingrad. Each barrage brought with it the sound of inevitability, the realization that no matter how hard they fought, the end was coming. There was no escape from the fate that had been sealed the moment they had entered the city. The cries of the dying soldiers, muffled by the snow, seemed to echo through the frozen ruins, carried by the winds like the final whispers of a war that had already consumed them. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of destruction, and even the sky appeared to mourn their fate. And then, as the smoke cleared and the echoes of the final assault faded into the cold, the silence descended like a blanket over the city. The battle, which had raged for so long, had finally come to its end. There was nothing left but the ruins, the bodies, and the knowledge that Stalingrad had claimed the lives of all who had stepped foot in its cursed streets. The Soviets, victorious, had broken the German forces, but at a cost of their own. And for the Sixth Army, there would be no retreat, no escape, only the final cold embrace of death. The command post was silent, save for the steady crackling of static on the radio. General Paulus sat hunched over the desk, his fingers trembling as he prepared the final coded message to Berlin. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, the final transmission from the Sixth Army trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, a last plea, a final report to a distant leader who had never once stepped foot in the city, never once seen the devastation that now surrounded him. Paulus' hands, cold and stiff with exhaustion, moved mechanically as he typed the message that would seal their fate. The words came slowly, each one a reluctant admission of the truth he had long known but had been unable to utter until now. The Sixth Army was lost, trapped in a city that had turned into a tomb. His officers, gathered around him, watched in grim silence, knowing what the message would contain: no hope, no reinforcements arriving, just the harsh reality of the encirclement that had doomed them all. The radio operator at his side worked quickly, fingers flying over the dials, trying desperately to reach Berlin, to send the message, to report the reality of their defeat. Outside, the distant sound of Soviet artillery was constant, and every now and then, the ground would shake under the impact of a shell. But here, in the heart of the frozen city, there was no escape, no relief. The faint hope that had clung to them, the promise of victory, was fading with every passing second, replaced by the bitter certainty of their failure. As the radio operator sent the message, the words were clear: victory or death. It was Hitler's final demand. In those 4 words, the Führer's unwavering grip on his officers and soldiers remained absolute. There could be no surrender, no withdrawal, no retreat. The orders from Berlin had always been absolute, delivered with the cold certainty of a man who had never witnessed the hell his troops faced. Victory or death, it was the command that echoed through the walls of every bunker, every trench, every frozen building. It was a demand that was slowly killing his army, that was trapping them in an ever-tightening circle of death. The radio operator, his face pale from the effort, paused, glancing at Paulus. Tears began to well in the operator's eyes, but there were no words. The message, so cold, so devoid of any humanity, felt like a sentence, not just for the soldiers in Stalingrad, but for everyone trapped in the Führer's delusions. There was no hope left. The words of authority, once clear and powerful, had become nothing more than empty echoes that were losing their meaning. The transmission continued, but the voice of the radio operator now carried a brokenness that could no longer be hidden. The once proud, staunch loyalty to the Führer and his cause had now cracked beneath the weight of the reality they were facing. The operator, along with the others in the room, had come to understand what Paulus had known for so long: the end was inevitable. As the radio operator transmitted the message, faintly, a voice on the other end of the line answered. The connection was weak, crackling, almost impossible to hear. And then, suddenly, the connection faded, as if the message was too much to bear, too heavy for the thin wires of communication to carry. The radio became silent, the static deepening as the line went dead. The radio operator, his face a mask of despair, pulled his hand back from the receiver, his fingers trembling. In the moments that followed, the men inside the command post were left in the hollow stillness, their faces expressionless, their eyes turned toward the radio, which had now become nothing but a symbol of their broken loyalty. The connection, so tenuous before, had now disappeared completely. The city of Stalingrad, once a thriving industrial hub, was now fully cut off. The world outside seemed to have vanished, and all that remained was the frozen, barren landscape and the sound of Soviet artillery closing in on their last defenses. As the men of the 6th Army listened to the silence that followed, it felt as though the world had collapsed in on them. The radio operator wiped his eyes, his tears mixing with the cold sweat on his forehead. There was no more transmission, no more orders to follow, only the hollow echo of a once great army lost to the frenzied delusions of a man they had never even seen. The message had been sent, but it was no longer a call for help, it was an admission of defeat, a final testament to the price of blind loyalty. And in that final, crushing silence, the men of the 6th Army knew their fate, the war was lost, and Stalingrad had claimed them all. Beneath the charred ruins of Stalingrad, where the buildings had once stood tall and proud, there now existed a twisted reflection of a hospital. It was no longer a place of healing but a makeshift refuge for the broken and the dying. The streets above had long since fallen silent, the battles above fought to a deadly conclusion. Now, in the darkened, frozen heart of the city, the wounded soldiers were left to suffer, their wounds festering without the care they desperately needed. Inside the abandoned structures, soldiers lay in piles, not on beds, but on the hard concrete floors or beneath the shattered remains of desks and tables. The faint light from flickering candles barely illuminated their gaunt faces, the shadows making their features seem distorted, as if they were not men, but ghosts lost in the ruins. The smell of death and infection permeated the air, mixing with the cold stench of rotting flesh. There were no clean bandages, no sterile instruments, only the rawness of human suffering. Surgeons, once men of skill, now worked with frozen hands, their breath turning to mist as they desperately tried to stem the bleeding of soldiers whose wounds were far beyond their abilities to fix. The cold was their greatest enemy, and every movement, every incision, felt like an eternity as they struggled to keep their hands steady. Candle stubs, barely offering any warmth, were the only light available, their weak flames flickering in the icy air like the last flickers of hope. The medicines that had once been stockpiled in warehouses now seemed like distant memories, unavailable, replaced with nothing but the harshness of desperation. In the chaos of this makeshift hospital, the soldiers, many of them too weak to speak, whispered apologies instead of prayers. They had once fought for victory, for glory, but now all they could offer were the words of men who knew their time had come. The dying whispered their regrets, their apologies to comrades, to families they would never see again. "I'm sorry, forgive me," they muttered, the words barely audible over the constant groan of pain that filled the room. There was no divine intervention here, no mercy or comfort, just the endless suffering of those who had been left to die in a city where life had already ceased to exist. The surgeons moved from one soldier to the next, their faces pale and hollow. They were no longer just performing their duties, they were simply passing through the motions, trying to keep the men alive for just a little longer. But the inevitability of death hung over them all, like a dark cloud pressing down on their every action. The feeling of helplessness was palpable. They had long since accepted the fact that they could not save these men. They could only ease their suffering, however briefly. And so, the rats came. In the silence of the ruined hospital, the rats became the only living audience to the soldiers' final moments. They scurried over the cold floor, feeding on the scraps of food that had been left behind, on the discarded rags, on the men who could no longer defend themselves. They seemed almost like specters, their glowing eyes reflecting the candlelight, watching silently as the men succumbed to their wounds, their suffering mirrored by the gnawing hunger of the rats. The battlefield above had fallen silent, but the death in the hospitals beneath the ruins continued, a suffocating stillness that seemed to drag on endlessly. The soldiers, too weak to fight off the rats, lay silently in their beds, knowing the end was inevitable. They could hear the rustling of the rats, their claws scratching against the walls, but there was no strength left to drive them away. The rats were now just another part of the suffering, another reminder of how far they had fallen. In this hospital of shadows, there was no dignity, no honor. There was only the relentless march of time, a procession of men falling, one by one, into the icy grip of death. For those who could still hear, the sound of the rats became an unholy lullaby, a reminder that in the end, it wasn't Soviet artillery or hunger that would claim them, it was the endless march of nature, the decay of the human body, and the silent, gnawing hunger of the creatures that would outlive them all. The days in Stalingrad had long since blurred together. The battles were no longer about victory, but simply about surviving. The city, which had once thrummed with life and ambition, had now become a graveyard, and the men trapped within it were no more than shadows of their former selves. The walls of Stalingrad had grown silent, broken only by the sound of Soviet artillery and the occasional cry of a man who had lost all hope. Inside the battered command post, General Paulus sat in a chair, staring at the maps laid before him, though he could no longer make sense of the lines and numbers. His eyes, hollow from days without sleep, scanned the surrounding wreckage, the shattered walls, and the men who had once followed him with pride. They were skeletal, their faces gaunt and drained of life, their bodies barely clinging to the thread of existence. There were no cheers of victory here, no cries of triumph, just a final silence that had come to dominate the hearts of those who had once believed in the mission, in the cause. The radio crackled again, and the same familiar voice echoed through the room, carrying with it a message that had come to feel like an eternal weight: you must not surrender. Hitler's orders were final, his demand unyielding. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, and Paulus had been promoted to that rank only to find himself caught in the Führer's delusions, bound to obey orders that made no sense in the face of reality. Victory or death, it had been the directive from the beginning, and it had led them here, to a city consumed by the dead, the final remnants of a once proud army trapped in the ruins. As the radio message continued to echo in the cold silence, Paulus looked around him. The faces of his officers were like those of the men they led, hollow, vacant, marked by a suffering that could no longer be hidden. They had fought with honor, but now they stood in the presence of a nightmare that had no end. The Soviets were closing in, their encirclement complete. The supply lines were cut, and the soldiers were starving, freezing. The hope of victory had long since vanished, replaced by the slow death that had overtaken them all. For months, Paulus had obeyed, had followed Hitler's orders with the discipline and loyalty that had defined his career. He had never been a man driven by ambition or desire for power. He had been a man of order, of precision, a soldier who had done what was required of him. But now, standing in the heart of a crumbling army, he could no longer reconcile the order he had been given with the reality before him. The men who had once rallied behind him were now dead or dying, and the very city that they had fought for had become their tomb. The weight of obedience had been too much. The men around him were no longer soldiers, they were ghosts, their lives slipping away with each passing moment. There were no glorious speeches left to be made. There was no fighting spirit left to ignite. Only the cold silence of death, creeping through the streets of Stalingrad, claimed them all. And yet, the radio continued to crackle with orders from Berlin, each one reinforcing the madness of the situation. Victory or death, the Führer had commanded. But as Paulus sat in his command post, looking into the faces of his men, the truth became undeniable: this was not victory. There would be no triumph here. The city had already fallen. The men who had once believed in honor and victory had died in the streets, their bodies abandoned, their sacrifices forgotten. At last, as the final remnants of his Sixth Army lay broken around him, Paulus made the decision that would forever change the course of the battle. On January 31, 1943, he issued the order. Silence. No more messages of defiance, no more promises of victory. The city had become a prison, and the Sixth Army had been lost. They had fought and bled for a cause that had already failed. The order was given: surrender. The men who had followed Paulus, who had believed in the Führer's orders, now found themselves faced with a new reality, one that carried with it the weight of their own humiliation, the collapse of their once noble cause. But even in surrender, there was no escape. The loyalty they had given, the obedience that had bound them together, had become the very chains that had sealed their fate. The end had come, not with the triumph of battle, but with the quiet rebellion of a broken man, a man who had refused to die for a delusion that had already claimed them all. The fighting stopped as if the very soul of the city had been taken with it. For 6 months, the streets of Stalingrad had been filled with the sounds of war, the constant echo of gunfire, the roar of artillery, the desperate cries of soldiers and civilians alike. The city had endured more suffering than most could fathom, but now, as January 31st drew to a close, there was nothing left but silence. The Soviet troops finally entered the ruined cellars where the remnants of the Sixth Army had made their last stand. The frozen city no longer seemed like a place of life but a mausoleum, a graveyard where every corner held the echoes of the battles fought and lives lost. The German soldiers, their rifles heavy in their hands, now laid them down, some reluctantly, others with a resigned exhaustion that had been building for weeks. Their bodies, once proud and defiant, were now mere shells, as empty as the city around them. They dropped their rifles like ghosts shedding their burdens, the weapons that had once symbolized their strength now useless, like the ideals that had brought them here. The Soviets moved through the streets, their presence like an indifferent wave, sweeping through the ruins. The battle for Stalingrad was over, but the cost was too great for either side to fully comprehend. The men who had fought, bled, and died were now ghosts themselves, lost in the rubble of a city that would never be the same. And in the quiet aftermath, the city exhaled. After 6 months of relentless agony, of screams swallowed by the winds, of death and destruction bleeding into the earth, the stillness finally descended. The sky, once clouded by smoke, now stood in a muted gray, the sun dimmed by the endless winter. There was no victory here, no celebration. There was only a peace that felt like the last exhale of a dying animal. The snow, so cold and indifferent, began to fall gently over the city, covering the bodies of the fallen soldiers. It was as if the earth itself wanted to hide the evidence of the horrors that had unfolded here. The corpses, now frozen in place, became part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the debris of war. Some soldiers, their faces contorted in the agony of their final moments, were left where they fell, while others had been dragged off into the shadows by the Soviets, their names forgotten, their sacrifices unnoticed. The Soviets who had liberated the city found only ruin. Stalingrad, a once thriving industrial hub, now lay in ruins. The streets were empty, the buildings shattered, the once vibrant hum of industry replaced by a suffocating silence. The land was now scarred, its heart torn out by the fury of war. The peace that followed the capitulation was not a victory, it was merely the end of a chapter that had lasted too long, a bitter conclusion to a tale of miscalculation and delusion. In the aftermath, there was only the weight of what had been lost, not just lives, but the humanity of those who had fought. The soldiers of the Sixth Army would not return to their homes, their families would never see them again. The Soviets, too, would carry the scars of the battle for the rest of their lives. The cost had been too high, and the price of victory felt like a hollow victory. The captives began their long march eastward, trudging through the frozen wasteland that had once been a battlefield. The Soviet soldiers guided them with ruthless efficiency, their faces masked by the biting wind as they herded the defeated German soldiers forward. In the distance, the once proud Sixth Army, now reduced to a broken column of men, moved like ghosts, their ranks thinned by the cold, by hunger, by the brutal pace of the march. 265,000 men, once part of a formidable fighting force, were now prisoners, frozen and defeated, their lives a mere shadow of the battlefield glory they had once known. The hunger gnawed at their insides, and the frost had already begun to claim the weakest. Men dropped like fallen trees, their bodies too frail to continue. The snow fell relentlessly, as if nature itself was joining in the retribution, covering the faces of those who could not keep up with the march. The Russian soldiers moved with no sympathy, their eyes as cold as the wind, their orders simple: march. For those who faltered, there was no second chance. The prisoners of war, once proud soldiers, were now nothing more than animals, strung together in chains of despair. By nightfall, the first of the dead began to appear, lying in the snow, too far from the column to be saved. They had not fallen in battle, they had fallen to the cold. The Soviets moved on without a glance, leaving the bodies behind, the snow quickly covering them, turning them into shapes that would remain forgotten, marked only by the endless white horizon. Hunger, frostbite, and the brutality of captivity were claiming their toll by the hour, and with each step, the frozen wasteland swallowed more lives. The soldiers who remained, those still conscious and still able to walk, were broken. Their faces, once full of defiance and pride, were now gaunt and hollow, their eyes sunken from weeks of deprivation. The march east felt endless, the world reduced to a blinding expanse of white that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no horizon, no end in sight. The prisoners, too weak to fight back, could only shuffle forward, their feet slipping in the snow, their limbs stiffened by the cold. The guards, once full of contempt and hatred for their captives, now moved with an air of detachment, their spirits having long since been crushed by the same cold and despair that had taken the men they were meant to control. They no longer had the will to punish, to torment. The hatred that had driven them for months had now faded into something far worse: indifference. The prisoners no longer mattered to them, as there was no victory in capturing the vanquished. They were simply numbers, bodies to march across the wasteland until they either collapsed or succumbed to the elements. The sound of footsteps in the snow was the only reminder that anyone was still alive, still moving through the white hell. With each day, more men fell. Weakness, once an enemy of war, was now the ally of the elements. Frostbite claimed more and more of them, fingers, toes, ears, all falling away to the bitter cold as if nature itself was stripping them of their humanity. The soldiers did not weep. They had nothing left to cry for. The Soviets, indifferent and silent, led them forward, the white world ahead of them as cold and unyielding as the march itself. 1 in 20 would live to see home again, but for the rest, the journey was already decided. The snow-covered ground would be their grave. Their bodies, left to rot in the wilderness, would be swallowed by the snow, their names lost in the icy winds. And even for those who would survive, their lives would be marked by the shadows of loss, forever haunted by the ghosts of those who had not made it. They would be survivors, but survivors of a tragedy so vast that it would leave nothing but silence in its wake. As the Sixth Army stumbled through the endless snow, the Soviet forces moved silently through the battlefield that had become a frozen tomb. The once mighty army that had filled the streets of Stalingrad with the noise of war was now reduced to scattered remnants, prisoners, ghosts of men who had fought and fallen, their bodies blanketed by the snow, their lives cut short in a foreign land. Amid the wreckage of the fallen, the Soviets began their work. They collected the abandoned items, the remnants of lives lost too quickly. Among these were the letters written by men who had once believed in victory, who had once sent home messages filled with hope, with promises of return, with tales of battle and pride. Now, those letters were just fragments of the past, stories never told to their recipients, confessions left to linger in the wind like forgotten words. The Soviet soldiers, as they moved through the wreckage, began to gather the letters. They found them buried beneath the snow, caught in the ruins of collapsed buildings, or hidden in the pockets of soldiers who had long since fallen. These letters, unsent, unread, carried the weight of the men who had written them, men whose names would fade into history and whose stories would never be shared. Some were written to mothers, some to wives, some to friends, and some were written in desperate moments of reflection, filled with guilt or confession. Some of the letters spoke of love, of promises made to wives and children, of dreams of a life after the war, of a return to home and hearth. Others, however, were darker, filled with regret, with guilt over choices made in the name of duty, or confessions of fear and desperation that had never been spoken aloud. There were those who begged for forgiveness, who wrote as though they could somehow erase the suffering they had caused, the lives they had destroyed in their service to a regime they no longer believed in. Each letter, written in the dark corners of the ruined city, became a testament to the men who had lived and died in its shadow. The Soviet soldiers read these letters, their faces hard and unreadable, their eyes momentarily flickering with the weight of the words. They were the last to touch the words of the men who had once invaded their land, the final contact with soldiers who were now the defeated. As they read, the harshness of war was revealed in its fullest form, not in the form of weaponry or artillery, but in the vulnerability of the soldiers who had fought and bled in the streets of a city that had swallowed them whole. The letters told stories of men caught in a world where loyalty had been betrayed, where humanity was buried beneath the cold veneer of battle, and where the final end came not in glory, but in cold, crushing defeat. Decades later, historians would find these letters, hidden remnants of a war, preserved in the ice and snow. They would piece together the voices of the dead, the stories of men whose final words had never reached the families they were intended for. Each letter would become a voice from the past, a haunting echo from the time when hope still flickered in the hearts of soldiers, before it was extinguished by the unforgiving reality of war. The words on the pages would speak of dreams lost to the winter, of men who had once hoped for a future that would never come. Each letter, each word, became a heartbeat trapped in the ice, a moment of humanity frozen in time. The words were fragile, yellowed with age, but still they held a small flicker of warmth, the warmth of love, of human connection, of a world that had long since disappeared beneath the weight of war. But even in their fragility, these letters carried something eternal, something that the men who had written them would never see, the memory of their lives, preserved not by stone or monument, but by the very words they had written in the final moments of their existence. The Soviets collected these letters, not as trophies, but as fragments of a lost world, a world where men had once been human, with hopes and dreams and loves of their own, a world where they were not just soldiers in a war, but people with stories that deserved to be told. And though the letters would never reach their intended destinations, their words would live on, echoing across the generations, carried on the cold winds of history. The weight of captivity settled heavily on General Paulus, his once proud uniform now replaced with the cold, threadbare clothes of a prisoner. The brutal march eastward, the freezing nights, the suffocating silence of Stalingrad's ruins had stripped him of his dignity, but it was the stillness of the camp that left the deepest marks on his soul. The world around him felt distorted, unreal, like some nightmare that had pulled him away from the battlefield and placed him in a new kind of purgatory. Gone were the frozen streets, the endless fighting. In their place were warm rooms, bright lamps, and the uncomfortable questions of Soviet interrogators. It was as if the cold, the hunger, the desperation of Stalingrad had never existed. His hands, once numb from the frozen hell of the city, now sat before him in the warmth of a makeshift office, but the comfort of this new reality only highlighted the contrast, the strangeness of his situation. The interrogator's words were distant, like a dream he couldn't fully wake from. Outside, the harsh winter of Stalingrad had been replaced with the soft, almost peaceful hum of Soviet machinery, the rhythm of a country that had triumphed, had endured. And yet, Paulus felt disconnected from it all. The peacefulness of this new world felt as foreign to him as the city's frozen streets had once felt to the Soviets. In the quiet, between the questions, he could hear the whispers of his own thoughts, those that had been buried beneath his obedience and loyalty. The Soviet interrogators asked him about strategy, about the German failures, but Paulus' mind was somewhere else entirely, drifting into reflection. He heard Hitler's rage in his mind, the screams of a man who could not fathom failure. He knew, too, that in Germany, he was now branded a traitor, someone who had failed to carry out orders. There would be no honor for him, no place in the history of the Reich. The Führer's orders had been clear, no surrender, no retreat. Yet here he was, in a warm room, a prisoner, his once mighty army scattered, decimated, and destroyed. The silence between the interrogations stretched on. Paulus's eyes wandered, almost involuntarily, to a cracked mirror in the corner of the room. He saw his own face reflected back at him, pale, gaunt, older than he remembered. It was the face of a man who had once believed in the cause, who had once marched with certainty toward what he thought was a glorious future. But now, the reflection seemed foreign to him. Obedience had driven him here, to this moment of brokenness, where the reality of his situation was no longer something he could ignore. Loyalty had become his sin, and the realization settled on his shoulders like a weight too heavy to bear. In the solitude of his captivity, Paulus wondered how it had all gone so wrong. He had believed in the Führer, in the mission, in the cause. He had obeyed. He had done what was required of him, fought the battles that were demanded, and followed the orders that had come from the highest authority. But now, as he stared at his own reflection in the mirror, he couldn't escape the truth that had gnawed at him since his capture. Obedience had led him to this, and obedience had condemned him. Had he been wrong? Had his blind loyalty to a delusional leader been the thing that had broken them all? Stalingrad had been a tragedy, but it was more than just a defeat, it was the end of something. The war, the cause, the dreams of victory, they had all been built on lies, and now, they lay shattered in the snow. How had he, a man so deeply loyal to the order and structure of his command, been led so far astray? How had obedience, once a virtue, become the source of his sin? The interrogators' voices grew louder as they returned, but Paulus remained in his thoughts. The questions they asked felt irrelevant now, their words simply a blur, drowned in the sea of his own reflection. What did it matter anymore? The Soviets had already won. Victory was no longer in question. His army had crumbled, his loyalty had betrayed him, and the world that had once been so full of purpose now seemed empty, a quiet echo of something lost. The silence returned, only this time it was different. It wasn't the quiet of a soldier waiting for the next order. It was the quiet of a man who had failed to see the truth, a man who could no longer escape the gravity of his obedience. His reflection in the mirror stared back at him, a silent reminder of all he had lost, a shattered man in a broken world. The news of Stalingrad's fall reached Berlin in the same way as it had reached every other city, gradually, like a rising tide, until it overwhelmed the news outlets and carried with it the weight of despair. At first, there was disbelief, a rumor, perhaps a miscommunication, surely a mistake. But as the reports continued to trickle in, the reality became impossible to ignore. The German Sixth Army had been encircled, trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, and now, it seemed, they were all but lost. The defeat was no longer just a strategic setback, it was the beginning of a collapse that would shake the very foundation of Nazi Germany. In Berlin, the announcement was met with a chill. The streets were filled with silent shock, the kind of quiet that comes before the storm. But inside the homes, inside the living rooms of ordinary Germans, the reaction was immediate. Mothers, standing in their kitchens or sitting in front of their radios, heard the word encircled, and a wave of horror washed over them. Fainting became common, women fell to the floor, overwhelmed by the knowledge that their sons, their husbands, their brothers, those who had gone off to war, were now caught in a deadly trap from which there was no escape. The news spread like wildfire, not just in Berlin, but across the entire Reich. In factories, where workers had once proudly produced the weapons of war, the word encircled hit hard. The machines that had hummed with the sound of industry now stood silent, as the workers stopped their tasks, faces drawn with the weight of the news. The illusion of victory, the false hope that had kept Germany moving forward in its pursuit of global conquest, began to disintegrate. The men and women who had been so sure of their invincibility, who had believed in the strength of the Reich, now found themselves questioning everything. How could this happen? How could the mighty German war machine be defeated so thoroughly in the streets of Stalingrad? The German propaganda machine, once the master of illusion, now scrambled to control the narrative. Goebbels issued statements, filled with venomous rhetoric, urging the people to remain steadfast, to continue fighting in the name of the fatherland. But the people knew. The truth had seeped through the cracks of the propaganda, and the disbelief was too great to conceal. The illusion of victory had been shattered not just by the loss at Stalingrad, but by the fact that Hitler, the man who had promised so much, had led them into a war that was now clearly lost. The fighting spirit that had once been so proud now seemed hollow, and the streets of Berlin were filled with silent grief. Inside the Führer's bunker, however, Hitler raged. The defeat at Stalingrad was not only a military loss, it was a personal blow. He could not accept it. Victory had always been promised to the people of Germany, to the soldiers who had fought and died in his name, and now, with the collapse of the Sixth Army, everything seemed to fall apart. But the Führer would not allow himself to face the reality of defeat. Instead, he clung to his delusions and vowed revenge, vengeance on the Soviet forces, vengeance on the traitors he believed had betrayed his cause. Revenge, he promised, would come. The war would go on. There was no room for retreat, no room for reflection, no room for accepting the truth. Hitler's mind had been twisted, his sense of reality long gone. The people of Germany, however, were no longer convinced. The faith that had once bound them to the Nazi cause had now frozen into something else, defiance, perhaps, but also an overwhelming sense of loss. They could no longer pretend that the Reich was invincible. The once glorious dream of conquest now seemed like a nightmare, and the men and women who had once believed in it had become disillusioned, weary, and hollow. Hitler's defiance, his refusal to face the truth, no longer held the same power it once had. The people of Germany, looking at their fallen soldiers, at the crumbling empire that had once promised them so much, saw only the ruins of a dream that had burned out. The city of Stalingrad lay silent, its once proud streets now buried beneath the weight of ruin and destruction. What had been a symbol of Soviet strength was now a monument to suffering, a city that had been consumed by war. The firestorms, the artillery, and the endless siege had scarred the land. What had once been a thriving industrial heart had turned into a wasteland, a ghost of what it had been, a memory of death. The Soviet survivors wandered through the ruins, their faces blank with exhaustion, their eyes hollow from the horrors they had witnessed. They stepped cautiously over the remains of buildings that had once been homes and places of work, now nothing more than piles of debris and charred bones. The walls had been shattered, the streets transformed into labyrinths of rubble. Stalingrad was no longer a place for the living, it had become a place where memories went to die. Amidst the devastation, the faint sound of children's laughter could be heard. They played in the ruins, climbing over the helmets and bones of those who had fallen, turning the weapons of war into their toys, the skeletons of the dead into their jungle gyms. In their innocent play, the children seemed to erase the dark history of the place, reclaiming the land with their laughter. Yet, even in their joy, there was something haunting in their carefree movements, something that seemed to acknowledge that the city's pain was embedded in its very bones. Their laughter echoed through the streets like a hollow, mournful song, a song that could never fully drown out the horrors of the past. The Volga River, once the lifeblood of the city, continued to flow. The water seemed to wash away the ashes of what had come before, carrying them to the sea. But no matter how far the ashes traveled, no matter how far the river stretched, Stalingrad's soul remained bound to its ruins. The river, flowing once more, seemed to mourn the loss of all that had been. Stalingrad lives, but it lives in ruins. It lives as a monument to those who had suffered and died within its walls, to those who had fought and perished in its streets, and to those who had witnessed its destruction. The city had been burned and bombed, but its spirit lingered. It was not the city of Stalin anymore, it had become a city of ghosts, haunted by the echoes of those who had once called it home. In the quiet desolation, the survivors did not speak of victory, they spoke only of survival. The city's future was uncertain, its past forever marred by the fires of war. But for those who still wandered its broken streets, it was a place to remember, a place to honor the dead. Stalingrad would never be the same, but it would live on in the memories of those who had suffered there, those who had seen its transformation from a city of hope to a city of ruin. The long march east began in silence, a procession of the damned, their bodies broken, their spirits shattered. The prisoners of war, the remnants of Stalingrad's fallen army, began their trek toward the heart of the Soviet Union. The streets of Stalingrad, once a city of resistance, had been left behind, now only an echo in their minds. Before them stretched a cold, endless expanse of snow and ice, a land that seemed to have no mercy for the living. The Soviet soldiers who now held them in captivity led the way with an indifference born of their own suffering. The German soldiers, though few in number now, followed with the vacant, lifeless steps of men who had already given up hope. Each step they took carried them farther from the ruins of Stalingrad, but no distance was enough to sever the bond they felt to that city. Stalingrad was not just a place, they had come to realize it was a destination, a symbol of their own failure. The memories of the city, of the endless battles and the final defeat, clung to them like the snow that stuck to their tattered clothes. Their legs, frozen and stiff, carried them with the weight of regret in every movement. They no longer walked with purpose, they walked simply to endure, to survive. The cold gnawed at them from all sides. Their feet, already swollen and raw from the endless walking, were now a mass of frozen flesh. Frostbite spread like wildfire, creeping up their legs, their arms, their faces. But there was no time for medical care, no time for sympathy. The soldiers kept moving, step by step, knowing that each step could bring them closer to death. They were already dead men walking, their bodies half frozen, their minds numb. The world around them was a bleak expanse, and the sky above seemed to press down on them, a heavy, suffocating weight. It was as though nature itself had turned against them, holding them in a grip of doom that they could never escape. Some of the men had been broken by the ordeal. They stumbled, their eyes vacant, their faces gaunt. The frostbite had taken parts of them, fingers, toes, ears, parts that would never heal, parts that would be left behind on the path they walked. But even more than the physical wounds, it was the mental toll that had shattered them. The men who had once believed in their cause, who had followed their orders without question, now found themselves questioning everything. Loyalty seemed so meaningless now, like an old dream that had been replaced by the harsh truth of their situation. What had they fought for? What had they given their lives for? As they marched through the frozen expanse, the echoes of Stalingrad followed them, each step a reminder of the defeat they had suffered, each moment another lost piece of the idealism they had clung to for so long. Some of the men, broken by their ordeal, began to whisper to one another, questions that had never crossed their minds before. They wondered if their loyalty had been misplaced, if the cause they had once believed in had been nothing more than a lie. The Soviet soldiers who led them showed no signs of cruelty, only indifference. Their captivity had turned the German soldiers into ghosts, empty shells of men who had once been proud, now reduced to shadows of what they had been. The men who had sacrificed everything now had nothing, no ideals, no cause to fight for, just the bleak, endless white of the steppe. Some clung to their shattered ideals, unwilling to let go of the image of a glorious Germany, of a war that would somehow still be won. But for others, the light of hope had already gone out. They no longer had the strength to believe. The men who had fought at Stalingrad were not the same men who had marched into the city. They had been broken by the horror, by the winter, by the weight of their own failure. Each step they took felt like a slow march into oblivion, into a future that was now empty and unforgiving. And as they moved forward, the snow seemed to swallow them, the landscape stretching endlessly before them, just as their lives seemed to stretch into an eternity of emptiness. Stalingrad was no longer just a place, it was a memory, a symbol of their downfall. They had been to the edge of the abyss, and now they were being led back into the world, where the reality of their defeat awaited them. Survivors, but not survivors of a war, they were survivors of a broken dream, a lost cause that had led them all to this empty place. The prisoners of war were no longer soldiers, they were ghosts, wandering through the snow-covered landscape, their faces hollow, their bodies broken by the months of starvation, cold, and constant brutality. The march east had drained them of all strength, leaving behind only the shells of men who had once been part of the mighty German war machine. They were stripped of their uniforms, their insignia torn away, as if the very identity of who they were had been erased. They had been soldiers, commanders, heroes. Now, they were nothing but captives, humiliated and defeated. As they were marched into the Soviet prison camps, the soldiers shuffled forward with the weight of their failure pressing down on them. Their faces, once proud and defiant, now reflected nothing but sorrow and exhaustion. The Soviet soldiers who watched over them showed no sympathy, indifference was the only thing they offered. For them, the German prisoners were just another piece of the machinery of war. The line of captives stretched endlessly in the snow, their movements slow and stiff, like automata, each step a reminder of their humiliation. The men who had once marched into Stalingrad with pride now moved like zombies, their bodies emaciated, their skin stretched over bones. The months of deprivation had ravaged them, they were barely alive, their limbs weakened and stiff from both frostbite and starvation. The weight of deprivation was not just on their bodies but on their minds. They were no longer the proud soldiers who had entered the Soviet Union, they were broken husks of men, their minds shattered by the horrors of the past few months, by the endless cycle of war and death. The hopelessness in their eyes was unmistakable, each gaze a silent testament to the crushing weight of their defeat. Some of the men were pulled aside, forced into harsh interrogations, their exhausted bodies thrown into cold rooms, where they were questioned by Soviet officers who showed no mercy. The questions were harsh, accusatory, aimed at extracting whatever secrets they could. But the men had nothing left to give. Their minds were exhausted, and the idea of victory, of purpose, had long since faded. They could only offer the blank stares of men who had already lost everything. Others, however, were simply ignored, left to rot in the open air or to be forgotten by the system that now held them. In the camps, there were no names, only numbers, and even those faded as the days turned to weeks. Some of the men would find themselves pushed into the back of the camp, out of sight, out of mind. The Soviet soldiers, with their unflinching eyes, had seen countless captives before. They had no reason to care for the German soldiers who had once been their enemies. Now they were just another body to be dealt with, perhaps even left to die in the freezing cold. The aftermath of Stalingrad was not just marked by the physical scars of the men, it was etched into their souls. The prisoners would never be the same. They had been changed by the war, by the violence, by the humiliation of their defeat. The physical scars were easy to see, mangled limbs, faces disfigured by the cold and battle, but it was the emotional scars that would last the longest. The memories of Stalingrad, of the endless cold, of their starving comrades left behind in the ruins, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they were herded into the prison camps, their despair was visible in every look. There was no hope here. No dream of returning home. No promise of glory. There was only survival, and even that seemed out of reach. They had given their bodies, their souls, and now they were nothing more than captives, prisoners of war who had once believed in a cause that was now dead. The news of Stalingrad's defeat arrived in Germany like a sudden, brutal shockwave, reverberating through the streets of Berlin and beyond. The heartland of the Reich, once confident in its invincibility, now found itself confronted with a truth it could no longer ignore: the Sixth Army was lost, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that had been built over years of victory. For months, Hitler's propaganda machine had painted a picture of the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable force, invincible, omnipotent, and destined to conquer the world. Victory had been the mantra, the guiding principle that had carried the German people through the early successes of the war. But now, with the crushing defeat at Stalingrad, the myth that had sustained their belief was shattered. The truth of the situation seeped in slowly, inexorably, and with each passing day, it became clearer: the war was no longer just about victory, it was about survival. In Berlin, and in the cities and towns across Germany, the initial disbelief turned to grief. News of the defeat trickled in slowly at first, and then in waves, as families received word that their sons, husbands, and fathers had been trapped, captured, or killed. The familiar faces of soldiers who had once filled the streets, their uniforms adorned with medals of honor, now returned as empty promises, their bodies left behind in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. The realization settled in: this war was no longer the triumph they had imagined. The cost of their loyalty had been far greater than they could have ever fathomed. Mothers collapsed at the radio, clutching their children, hearing the word encircled and fainting, as though their very hearts had been ripped from their chests. Families that had once believed in Hitler's vision now found themselves drowning in grief and disillusionment. The Führer's promises had once seemed like the foundation of a brighter future, one of glory, empire, and victory. But with the fall of Stalingrad, those promises began to fracture, revealing the hollow core beneath. In the homes, in the factories, in the cafes, there was no celebration, no cheer for the victory that had been promised. Instead, there was only a slow collapse of spirit, as the weight of Stalingrad's loss bore down on the German people. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht had been shattered, and with it, the belief in the Führer's greatness began to erode. No longer were the German people willing to blindly follow the path that had led them into this hell. The questions began to rise, whispers in the shadows of doubt and anger, questions that would eventually turn into an uncontrollable wave. The people of Germany had watched as Hitler's promises had carried their soldiers to victory, but now, they had seen how easily those promises could turn into ashes. The Stalingrad defeat exposed the truth: the Nazi regime was not invincible, and the Führer's orders could lead not only to glory but to destruction. What had once seemed like inevitable conquest now seemed like an unwinnable war. The heartland of the Reich, which had once stood proudly beneath the banner of the swastika, now found itself questioning its leader, its cause, and its future. As the news of the defeat spread, cracks began to form in the very foundation of Nazi Germany. Hitler's iron grip on the German people, once unchallenged, began to slip. The loyalty that had held the Third Reich together through early victories now gave way to a growing sense of hopelessness, and the population, exhausted, suffering, and disillusioned, began to turn. They questioned not just the military strategy, but the leadership that had brought them to this point. They saw not a vision of victory, but the ruins of their empire. The streets of Berlin, once filled with the hustle of war, now echoed with the silence of a people unsure of what to believe anymore. The once proud war machine that had conquered Europe now lay in tatters, and the men and women who had marched with pride and fury in their hearts now stood in the cold light of defeat, searching for answers that no one could provide. The loss of Stalingrad lingered like a poison in the very heart of the German war effort. In the halls of German high command, the defeat was felt not just in terms of military failure, but as a personal blow to the entire structure of Nazi ideology. But despite the crushing weight of this defeat, the machinery of war refused to stop. The generals, their faces drawn with fatigue and disbelief, debated strategies for future offensives, their minds spinning with the need to recover, to regroup, to somehow salvage what remained of the once mighty Wehrmacht. But at the top, in the mind of Adolf Hitler, there was no room for surrender. The Stalingrad catastrophe was too great, too damaging to acknowledge. Hitler, in his delusion, refused to see the truth. He could not accept that the war had already been lost. Instead, he clung to the fantasy of total victory, unwilling to entertain the idea that Germany had been broken, that the dream of a Third Reich that would last 1,000 years was crumbling before his eyes. The high command could see the truth, but they were bound to follow Hitler's orders, unable to break free from the rigid control that had driven them into the heart of this conflict. Victory or death had been the mantra from the beginning, and it was now impossible for any of them to escape the grip of delusion that had claimed their minds. Even in the face of Stalingrad's ashes, they continued to speak of future campaigns, of retaking the East, of pushing back the Soviets. Yet, with each passing day, it became clear that there was no longer any meaningful strategy, only an overwhelming sense of momentum, carrying them forward into an abyss that had already claimed them. As the war continued, the bloodshed stretched on. The Soviets, emboldened by their victory at Stalingrad, pushed forward relentlessly, their armies now fully aware of their own strength. The German forces, though still formidable, had already begun their slow, inevitable decline. Every offensive was met with greater resistance, every strategic retreat turned into a disaster. The losses mounted, and the German people, still hoping for victory, still clinging to the belief in Führer's words, began to feel the crushing weight of the war's toll. The civilians in the heart of Germany saw their young men march to the front lines, knowing deep down that many of them would never return. The factories, once busy with the machines of war, now fell silent as more and more resources were poured into an impossible battle. Stalingrad remained, always lingering in the minds of those who had witnessed it or heard of its horrors. For those who had fought in the city, the battle was not just a loss of territory, it was a defeat of the soul, a painful reminder that hubris, once so firmly rooted in the ideology of the Reich, had led them to a place where there was no redemption, no return. Stalingrad became a scar on the psyche of Germany, a constant reminder that their dreams of world domination had been built on false pretenses, on a belief that the Wehrmacht was invincible, and that the Führer was always right. The war continued, but the war was already lost. The true turning point had been reached in Stalingrad, even though the effects would not be fully realized until much later. The Wehrmacht, though still formidable, was broken. Its strength had been drained by the months of war and the devastating defeat in the East. As winter turned to spring, the war stretched onward, grinding down the remaining soldiers, taking away more lives, more bodies, more hope with each new campaign. And still, Hitler pressed forward, blind to the inevitable. In the shattered landscape of Europe, the German people began to see the truth, not in any formal announcement, but in the silence of Stalingrad. There was no victory on the horizon. The dreams of Nazi triumph were fading, replaced by the realization that the price of hubris had been far too great. The Soviets had broken them, but it was the Nazis' arrogance, their refusal to acknowledge reality, that had sealed their doom. And as the war continued to its bitter, inevitable end, the Germans would come to understand the true cost of their madness, the blood of millions, the ruins of their empire, and the hollow echo of a war fought for a lost cause. Decades after the last shot had been fired and the final survivor had staggered from the ashes of Stalingrad, the city itself remained a silent witness to one of history's most profound tragedies. The ruins of Stalingrad, though now quiet, were far from forgotten. They had become a symbol, not just of the battle fought there, but of the cost of war, the depths of human suffering, and the ultimate failure of the ideologies that had fueled the conflict. As the years passed, Stalingrad transformed into a monument, a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand what had happened, to piece together the shattered remnants of a story that had been left in the ashes. Historians, veterans, and even civilians began to revisit the battle, trying to comprehend the scale of loss that had unfolded in the frozen streets of the city. The survivors, those few who had lived through the horrors of the siege, told their stories over and over again, but even their words could not capture the truth of the suffering they had endured. The city, with its walls broken and its spirit shattered, stood as a reminder that no matter how much time passed, some things could never be forgotten. The truth of the battle, the scale of destruction, the death toll, the lives lost to the cold, the hunger, and the violence, remained a cold shadow over those who had survived. The men who had fought there, whether German or Soviet, could never escape the reality that Stalingrad had marked the end of something larger than a military conflict. It had been the end of an illusion, the death of the idea of an unstoppable army, the fall of the dream of empire. The devastation of Stalingrad was not just about the loss of a city, it was about the loss of humanity, the cost of fanaticism, and the consequences of men who had forgotten their own limits. In the years that followed, Stalingrad became a place where the past was memorialized, but never truly understood. Veterans returned to the ruins, now overgrown with the quiet nature that had reclaimed the city. They walked among the crumbling remains of the city walls, the bombed-out buildings, the sunken roads, the places where they had fought, bled, and lost everything. Some returned to pay homage to their fallen comrades, while others came in search of something that could explain the reason for it all, some meaning to give their suffering a purpose. But what could be said? What could possibly be understood after such a disaster? The civilians who had been caught in the storm of war had their own memories of Stalingrad. They, too, struggled to make sense of the nightmare they had lived through. Children who had been born after the war could only look at the ruins, seeing the ghosts of the past in the faces of their parents, whose pain never seemed to fade. In their hearts, there was no victory to celebrate, only the shadow of what had been lost. The city itself had become a symbol of the failure of human ambition, a place where the consequences of ideology had been fully realized, where men had fought not for survival, but for delusions. For the historians who sought to document the battle, the truth of Stalingrad was elusive. They sifted through the records, the letters, the photographs, trying to piece together a narrative that could explain the scale of the destruction, the depths of the human cost. But in the end, the cold finality of history proved too overwhelming to make sense of. The numbers, millions of lives lost, the cities destroyed, the shattered bodies, were too large, too incomprehensible. Stalingrad was more than just a military loss, it was a symbol of the failure of war, a reminder that the cost of human failure, of hubris, of fanaticism, was more than any one battle could ever truly explain. And so, Stalingrad remained, not just as a place, but as a memory, a warning etched into the heart of history. It stood as a reminder that no matter how grand the ambitions of men might be, no matter how far they stretch, they are always subject to the consequences of their own actions. Stalingrad, in the end, was more than just a battle. It was the turning point in a war that had claimed more than just cities and soldiers. It had claimed the souls of those who had fought it, and the world would never be the same.